It was a quiet morning in Minneapolis, the kind that feels half awake, where the air is cool and heavy with the smell of rain that hasn't started yet. And then out of nowhere, a voice cut through that calm, a man's voice trembling, broken, gasping for air. "My wife, she didn't make it. Please, help me." The dispatcher's training kicked in instantly. The man's words came out scattered, desperate, but there was no mistaking what this was. A life or death call. The clock read 8:43 a.m. as officers and paramedics were dispatched to West 61st Street, a quiet suburban block lined with modest houses, trimmed lawns, and a kind of S. But not today. When the first responders pulled up, they saw him standing at the front door, a man in his mid-50s, frozen pale, his face stuck somewhere between disbelief and horror. For a second, nobody moved. Then he lifted his hand and Jez. "Downstairs," he said, his voice cracked ha. The basement was dim, only one bulb flickering near the laundry area. The air felt stale, humid, heavy, and then just past the washer and dryer, the narrow bathroom came into view. Inside that small room, the silence was deafening. A woman's body lay curled in the bathtub, her head pressed against the silver spout as if she'd tried to pull herself up one last time. She wasn't breathing. The officers froze. For a heartbeat, all they could hear was the sound of dripping water from the faucet, one drop at a time. And then they saw it, the deep purple marks wrapping around her neck like a dark necklace. On the floor nearby, a thin white cable lay tangled in itself. A phone charger. That cord was no longer a simple household item. It had become a weapon. Detectives would later say, the bathroom looked like a story told in chaos. Shampoo bottles knocked over, towels crumpled, the shower curtain torn aside. It was the kind of scene that didn't need words to explain what had happened. You could feel it, the fight, the panic, the final desperate seconds. Outside, the rain finally began to fall, light at first just tapping against the windows, and in that moment officers knew this wasn't a random break-in. There were no broken locks, no shattered glass, no sign of a thief. Nothing stolen, nothing missing. Everything pointed inward to the family itself. When the medics confirmed there was nothing left to save, one of the senior detectives turned to the man who had called for help. "Sir," he said softly, "we're going to need you to come with us." The man nodded without a word. His hands trembled as he sat down on the cold floor beside the laundry machine. For a long time, he didn't speak. Then, in a whisper so quiet it was almost lost under the hum of the rain, he said her name. Michelle. Her full name was Huyen Trong Mi Hong, though everyone knew her as Michelle. She was 48 years old, a Vietnamese-American wife, mother, and business owner. The kind of woman who brought warmth into any room, and now she was gone. Good evening, and thank you for being here tonight, because the story I'm about to tell you is one of those cases that begins in a quiet American home and ends in a way that no one could have imagined. Michelle's story takes us deep into the private world of a family that looked perfect from the outside. 2 hard-working parents, 2 grown sons, a small business built from nothing, and years of shared struggle that should have meant peace. But behind those walls, something dark was growing, something silent, something that waited until that September morning to show its face. So, if you're listening right now, maybe settle in. If you haven't already, lock your door, turn off the lights if you're feeling brave. Because outside the rain has started at first, just a few drops, tapping softly against the glass, then slowly building into a steady rhythm. The kind of sound that makes the world feel smaller and the darkness feel closer. And it's in that darkness with that rain as our soundtrack that I'm going to tell you exactly what happened to Michelle. The first detectives to step into the basement that morning had been on hundreds of calls, but something about this one felt different. The house itself was calm too, calm as if time had stopped right after the violence. The hum of the air vent, the slow drip of the faucet, the faint scent of shampoo, mixed with something metallic in the air, it all blended into a silence that felt unnatural. They photographed everything inch by inch. The cracked shower rod, the half-empty bottle of conditioner on the tile, the phone charger coiled on the floor like a discarded snake. Every small detail would matter later, but right now it told a single story, a struggle that ended in seconds. The woman in the tub, Michelle, looked peaceful from a distance, but up close, the truth was written across her neck. The bruising was deep and precise, not random, not wild. This wasn't chaos, it was control. The narrow band of bruises formed a perfect ring, the mark of something pulled tight with deliberate force. One of the younger officers stepped back and swallowed hard. She fought, he whispered. And she had. Tiny half-moons of skin were visible beneath her fingernails, the kind that come from clawing at someone's arm from trying to breathe when there's no air left. Those traces, though small, were her last message to the world. Proof that she didn't go quietly. The crime scene team moved carefully. Each object went into its own plastic bag, towel fragments, the charging cord, a section of the shower curtain. The cable itself was thin, frayed near the end, its plastic stretched and worn. A cord meant to charge a phone, not to take a life. Upstairs, the husband sat on the edge of the couch, staring at his hands. His name was Tony Lee. He was 55 years old, Vietnamese, born quiet by nature, known in his community as hardworking and reliable. For 25 years, he and Michelle had built their life together from the ground up. Their nail salon in Richfield was successful, their sons grown. From the outside, they looked like a couple that had made it living proof of the American dream. But inside, investigators were already sensing a fracture that no one else had seen. One officer glanced at the family photos on the wall, two smiling faces at a beach, another at a holiday dinner. In every picture, Tony stood close beside Michelle, his arm gently around her shoulder. Now those same hands sat still on his knees, motionless. Downstairs, the medical examiner finished her work. Time of death looks like early morning, she said softly. Between 3 and 4. That single sentence changed everything. Tony's call to 911 came at 8:43 a.m. That meant hours had passed before he reached out for help. The detectives exchanged looks but didn't speak it aloud yet. They didn't need to. The silence said enough. Outside, the rain was steady, now soft but relentless, a curtain of gray blurring the quiet street. Neighbors gathered under umbrellas, whispering to one another. They'd seen the family for years, Tony mowing the lawn, Michelle waving as she left for work, the smell of home cooking drifting through open windows. None of it made sense. Inside the house, one of the detectives opened a drawer in the kitchen and froze. Lying on top of a stack of envelopes was a thin folder. Inside was a divorce petition. It bore Michelle's name and the date September 25, 2017. The very morning she died. That discovery hit like a thunderclap. The theory began to form, fragile but clear. This wasn't a break-in, this wasn't random, this was personal. It was heartbreak turned into rage. Tony didn't speak for most of the day. When the detectives finally asked him to come to headquarters, he agreed without protest. No handcuffs, no resistance. Just a quiet man walking through the rain with his head down, water soaking through his shirt. Behind them, inside that basement bathroom, the forensics team finished packing up the final piece of evidence, the phone charger. It was tagged, sealed, and marked for DNA testing. In that moment, none of them could know that it would hold the truth they were searching for. As the team left the house, one of the officers paused at the door and looked back. Through the window, he could still see the small bathroom mirror. It was cracked slightly along one edge, reflecting a faint image of the tub. He whispered under his breath, "She fought hard." And outside, the rain kept falling, washing down the driveway, carrying the last traces of a life that had ended before sunrise. But this was only the beginning. Because when the autopsy results came in the next day, they would confirm something even darker, a story written not just in bruises, but in blood and bone. And that's where things would start to unravel. When news of Michelle's death spread through the Vietnamese community in Minneapolis, disbelief rippled from one family to another. People who knew her could hardly take it in. Michelle wasn't just a business owner, she was the kind of woman who remembered your birthday, who slipped extra dollars into a friend's hand when times were hard, who cooked enough food to feed anyone who walked through her door. She and Tony had been together for more than 25 years. They came to America in the early 1990s, carrying almost nothing but each other. The stories they told friends were full of quiet pride, how they worked long hours, learned English together, saved every dollar, and opened their own nail and spa business in Richfield. To customers, they were a team. She handled clients with her easy smile, while Tony kept the books and supplies in order. Their shop was small but spotless, its soft music and lavender candles giving off the calm of two people who had built something honest. But what no one saw behind the calm surface was the tension that had been building in silence. Friends noticed that Tony had grown quieter in recent years, his smile shorter, his gaze distant. Michelle, on the other hand, had become more outgoing, more confident in her independence. She talked about wanting to travel, about visiting family back in Vietnam. She was proud of what she'd built. But sometimes pride can look like distance to someone who feels left behind. Her closest friends later said she'd been thinking of starting fresh, of finding her own happiness again. And tucked inside her purse found later at the crime scene was a single folded page, her first draft of divorce papers. It was simple, just a few lines requesting separation and fair division of property. But to Tony, it must have felt like a knife. Detectives pieced together the final days before her death. Michelle had spent that Sunday working late at the salon, then visiting a friend afterward. She laughed, she shared dinner, she didn't mention fear. When she got home, she parked her car in the driveway at about 3:15 in the morning. What happened after that was reconstructed through a mix of Tony's confession, forensic evidence, and neighbor accounts. The argument started almost immediately. Words became shouting, then came silence. By the time dawn broke, the house looked normal again from the outside. Curtains drawn, lights off, but inside the scene was frozen in horror. The autopsy report came back that afternoon. It confirmed what investigators already suspected: Michelle died of strangulation. Her hyoid bone was fractured, the soft tissue around her throat bruised from the thin pressure of the cord. There were faint scratches along her arms and shoulders where she'd tried to fight back, and under her fingernails were small flakes of skin that later matched Tony's DNA. It left no doubt. She hadn't just been attacked, she'd known exactly who was hurting her. At police headquarters, Tony sat motionless in the interview room. The detective placed a small paper cup of water on the table and waited. No handcuffs, no shouting, just silence. "Tony," he said gently, "tell us what happened." For a long time, Tony said nothing. His eyes stayed fixed on the table. Then he exhaled slowly, his shoulders trembling. "She said she wanted to leave," he whispered. "She said she found someone else." He covered his face with both hands, voice breaking. "I lost control." The statement that followed was clear, detailed, and hauntingly calm. He told them about the argument, about following her into the bathroom, about grabbing the charging cord from the counter. "It wasn't planned," he said. "It just happened." The detectives recorded everything word for word. When it was over, Tony signed the confession without hesitation. In the American legal system, that kind of voluntary statement carries enormous weight. But even with his words on paper, the investigators couldn't escape the feeling that something deeper had gone wrong long before that night. Tony wasn't a monster in the way people imagine one. He was an ordinary man who'd let resentment grow in silence until it turned into something unrecognizable. That evening, as rain continued to fall over, Minneapolis officers transported Tony to the county jail. The house on West 61st Street was sealed off, its yellow tape fluttering in the wet wind. Inside, the light in the basement bathroom still flickered. The tub had been drained, the evidence collected, but the air still held that heavy mix of soap and sorrow. Neighbors who passed by the next day said the smell of rain and bleach lingered for days. Some swore they could still hear the faint sound of water dripping in the dark. From the outside, the house looked the same as it always had, a perfect little home on a quiet American street. But the illusion was gone forever. And when the case reached the courthouse weeks later, that illusion would be shattered again, this time under the bright lights of justice. Because what happened next wasn't about forensics or evidence anymore. It was about grief, anger, and the question that never really leaves a courtroom: how does love turn into this? By the time Tony Lee sat in that gray-walled interrogation room, the sun had climbed high enough to make the blinds glow. The steady hum of the air vent filled the silence, that same heavy kind of quiet that presses on a person's chest. He hadn't asked for a lawyer, hadn't asked for water, hadn't even looked up when detectives entered the room. He just stared at his hands, the same hands that had built a business, raised 2 sons, and now in a single moment of rage destroyed everything he'd ever built. The lead detective, a calm middle-aged man who'd spent 2 decades in homicide, slid a photo across the table. It showed the basement bathroom, the overturned bottles, the torn curtain, the stillness of a woman who had fought for her life. Tony didn't flinch. "Tony," the detective said softly, "you told us you and your wife argued. You told us you lost control. Tell me what that means." For a long moment, nothing. Then Tony inhaled slowly, the breath trembling as it left his lungs. "She said she was leaving me," he whispered. "She said she loved someone else. I told her she couldn't. I told her she was my wife." He rubbed his forehead, eyes closed, voice low. "She walked away from me, went into the bathroom. I followed. I didn't mean to hurt her. I just wanted her to listen. And then..." His voice broke. "I don't remember thinking. I saw the phone cord on the counter. I just wanted her to stop saying those words." He lifted his hand slightly, as if holding the invisible cord. "It happened so fast. She fought. She tried to scream, then she stopped moving. I let go." The room stayed silent except for the faint buzz of the fluorescent light above. The detective didn't speak right away. He'd heard confessions before, some angry, some cold, but this one felt different. There was no performance in it. Just exhaustion. "Did you try to help her?" Tony nodded weakly. "I tried to wake her up. I shook her. I thought maybe she'd start breathing again, but she didn't. So I left. I drove to my sister's house. I told her what I'd done." He paused and looked at the detective for the first time. "I didn't mean to kill her. I loved her." Those words hung in the air, hollow and heavy. The detective stepped out of the room to review the recording. Every word was clear. No threats, no pressure. Just a man collapsing under the weight of his own actions. It was, by every legal standard, a voluntary confession. When Tony's sister was interviewed later that afternoon, her story matched perfectly. She described how he had shown up at her door before sunrise, face pale, hands shaking, saying over and over again that he had done something terrible. She'd begged him to call the police, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. "He looked empty," she said. "Like the person I knew wasn't there anymore." By the time Tony finally called 911, hours had passed. His voice on that recording would later be played in court, the same broken voice that started this entire case. At the Hennepin County Medical Examiner's office, technicians were already working through the night. DNA samples from the phone cord matched both Michelle and Tony. Fibers from the same cable were found beneath her nails, confirming the struggle. The story his confession told matched perfectly with the evidence. There was no mystery left, no question of who had done it, only the question of why. When the detectives came back into the room, they found Tony sitting quietly, head down. They read him his rights again, though it wasn't necessary. He nodded after each line, eyes fixed on the table. When they asked if he wanted to make a written statement, he took the pen without hesitation. His handwriting was shaky but legible, every word simple, almost childlike. "I hurt my wife. I killed her. I am sorry. I wish I could take it back." That single sheet of paper would become one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in the case. As night fell, rain began again outside, tapping softly against the glass of the precinct windows. Tony sat in the corner of his cell, his clothes still damp from the morning. He didn't ask for anything. Not food, not water. Just quiet. In another part of the city, Michelle's family gathered in stunned disbelief. Her sons couldn't understand how their father, the man who had taught them to ride bikes, who had worked double shifts to keep food on the table, could also be the man who took their mother's life. But as one of them said later, sometimes love doesn't end with hate. Sometimes it ends with control and the fear of losing it. And in the weeks that followed, that fear would follow Tony Lee into a courtroom filled with faces that once loved him, now watching as the story of that night was retold piece by piece. The confession had sealed his fate, but it hadn't given anyone peace. Not yet, because what came next would break even more hearts. Winter had settled over Minneapolis by the time Tony Lee walked into the courthouse. Outside snow fell in slow, heavy flakes, muffling the sound of traffic, turning the city into something ghostly and still. Inside, the air was sharp with the scent of coffee and the quiet murmur of reporters waiting for the trial to begin. The courtroom itself was small, pale walls, wooden benches, a crucifix hanging over the judge's bench. In the front row sat Michelle's family, their faces drawn, eyes red from weeks of grief. Just a few feet away sat Tony, thinner now, hands folded tightly together. He avoided looking at them. He couldn't. The prosecution began with facts, clear, steady, merciless. They described the scene, the cable, the autopsy, the scratches on his body. Each piece of evidence was like a brick stacking higher and higher until the picture was impossible to ignore. When they played the recording of Tony's 911 call, the room went still. The sound of his voice filled the air, trembling, desperate, the kind of voice that could only come from someone who'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Michelle's sons lowered their heads. Then came the photographs. The jurors looked down, hands covering mouths, some closing their eyes for a moment. The image of that basement bathroom was not one they'd forget. The defense didn't argue innocence. They couldn't. Instead, they tried to explain. They brought in psychologists who spoke about emotional breakdowns, impulsive violence, the human mind under unbearable pressure. They said Tony hadn't planned anything, that his wife's decision to leave him had pushed him into a state of uncontrollable passion. The term they used was crime of heat, not premeditated but spontaneous, not hatred but despair. The prosecutor stood and answered calmly. A man who strangles someone must keep his hands there until she stops breathing. That takes time. It is not a moment. It is a choice that continues every second it happens. The courtroom was silent. Even the air seemed to stop moving. During witness statements, Tony's sister testified first. Her voice shook as she told the jury how her brother had arrived at her door before dawn, crying, saying he'd killed his wife. She said he had loved Michelle deeply, that he wasn't a violent man. But even as she spoke, her words dissolved into tears. Then came Michelle's son. He was in his 20s, but in that courtroom he looked much younger, fragile in his grief. He told them about his mother's kindness, about how she would cook for the entire family every weekend, how she always said family came before everything. And then he said something that stayed with everyone who heard it. My father didn't just kill my mother. He killed the version of himself we believed in. Those words hung in the air, heavy as stone. When Tony was offered the chance to speak, he stood slowly. His voice was soft, almost whispering. I wish I could take that night back. I wish I could trade my life for hers. He paused, his breath shaking. I see her face every time I close my eyes. He wept quietly as the interpreter translated for the court. But no one clapped, no one comforted him. The line between pity and anger had long blurred, and grief had filled the space where forgiveness might have lived. On February 12, 2019, the judge read the sentence. 21 years and 9 months in prison. Tony lowered his head, tears falling silently. Behind him, Michelle's friends whispered prayers in Vietnamese, their words soft, their hearts heavy. Some thought the sentence was fair. Others called it too light. But the judge explained his reasoning carefully. Tony had confessed, had shown remorse, had no history of violence. It didn't undo the crime, but it meant something in the eyes of the law. When the gavel struck wood, the room seemed to exhale. The sound echoed like a closing door. Outside, the snow had turned to sleet. Reporters gathered near the steps, their cameras pointed toward the courthouse doors, waiting for the family to emerge. Michelle's sister-in-law spoke briefly. She was light in our lives, now we just want peace. Tony was led out through a side exit, hands cuffed, head bowed. The cold air hit his face, and for a second he stopped and looked up. Snow was falling again, slow and steady, the way rain had fallen on the morning she died. He whispered her name once more, before stepping into the transport van. And as the vehicle pulled away, the courthouse clock struck noon. Each bell seemed to carry a memory, the laughter from their salon, the smell of home cooking, the quiet nights when everything still felt safe. But now that safety was gone forever. Yet, even as this case closed somewhere far south of Minneapolis, another story was already beginning. Another night, another house, another family that would face something unthinkable. And it all started with the sound of gunfire just before dawn. After the sentence was handed down, the courtroom slowly emptied. Reporters packed up their gear, families embraced, and the heavy doors closed behind the last of the spectators. What was left behind was silence, the kind that lingers even after the sound fades. The kind that stays in the air, like a memory that refuses to leave. Michelle's family returned to the home on West 61st Street only once after the trial. They needed to collect her things. The police tape was long gone, but the marks from where it had been were still visible on the doorframe. Inside, everything looked almost the same as before. Her favorite teacup still lined the kitchen shelf. A framed family photo still sat on the mantel, showing a smiling woman with warm eyes, unaware that her story would one day end in tragedy. Her sons moved quietly from room to room, taking down photos, folding clothes, filling boxes. They spoke softly, as if afraid to wake the ghosts that lived there now. In the basement, they stopped at the doorway of the small bathroom. The walls had been scrubbed clean, fresh paint covering the stains, but the air still carried something they couldn't describe. It wasn't the smell of bleach or paint. It was the weight of memory. One of them whispered, "Let's go. We don't need to see it again." And so they left, closing the door behind them, leaving the house to its silence. Tony Lee began serving his sentence at a state correctional facility just outside Stillwater, Minnesota. He was nearly 60 years old when he arrived, wearing the standard gray uniform, carrying a single bag. Other inmates barely looked at him. In prison, men like Tony were not feared or respected. They were pitied, sometimes ignored, sometimes quietly despised. He spent most of his time in the prison library, reading books in Vietnamese and English, attending chapel on Sundays, writing letters that he never sent. One of those letters, later found among his belongings, was addressed to his sons. It was only a single paragraph long. It said, "I am sorry for breaking the world we built together. Every day I see your mother in my dreams. I wish I could give back what I took." He signed it simply, Dad. Back in Minneapolis, the community that had once gathered at Michelle's nail salon continued to keep her memory alive. They placed a small, framed photo near the counter, surrounded by candles and white flowers. Customers still came in the soft sound of rain machines filling the air, and sometimes they would stop to whisper a prayer before sitting down. Those who knew her said they still heard her voice when they walked through the door, a faint echo of laughter, a kindness that seemed to linger in the walls. Life slowly began to move forward for her family, though nothing would ever be the same. Her sons pursued new lives far from that quiet street, but every September, when the air turned cool and the leaves began to fall, they returned to lay flowers by the front steps of the old house. Neighbors said they would see them standing there in the drizzle, heads bowed and then disappearing back into the rain. No words, no ceremony, just remembrance. And the house itself. It stayed empty for months after the tragedy. Some nights people walking by said they could still see a light flicker in the basement window, even though the power had been turned off long ago. Maybe it was nothing, or maybe it was just the way memories have of clinging to places where love once lived. Eventually, the house sold quietly to a young family who knew only pieces of its history. They painted the walls, replaced the floors, brought new life into it. But if you were to stand outside on a rainy night, when the air feels heavy and the wind moves just right, you might still feel it, the faint heartbeat of the life that ended there. The story of Tony and Michelle Lee was closed on paper, but not in the hearts of those who had loved them. It became a quiet warning, whispered through the community, a story told in low voices about love turned inward, about silence that became destruction. And as another spring came and the rain once again began to fall across Minnesota, that house on West 61st Street stood under a gray sky, windows reflecting the cold light of dawn. Inside, nothing moved. Outside, the rain fell harder, building rhythm against the roof, as if nature itself was keeping time for what would come next. Because hundreds of miles away, in a small town in Mississippi, another call was about to come through to 911. Gunfire before dawn. Screams through the dark. A different tragedy, a different kind of silence. It began just before dawn in the quiet town of Clinton, Mississippi, on a February morning that should have been like any other. The neighborhood was still half asleep, the kind of place where the loudest sound at that hour is usually a dog barking or a car starting down the street. But at 2:30 in the morning, that peace shattered. Gunfire ripped through the dark, followed by screams that made neighbors freeze where they stood. The shots echoed off the narrow cul-de-sac of Fox Hill Drive, each one louder than the last, until the entire block seemed to wake at once. Within minutes, the 911 center in Clinton lit up with calls. "There's yelling, someone's shooting, please hurry." Dispatchers immediately sent every available unit. The first patrol cars rolled in within minutes, headlights cutting through the fog. Officers could see the faint flicker of light inside one home, near the end of the street, curtains half drawn, a shadow moving back and forth behind the glass. Then came another, sound one no officer ever forgets. The distinct pop of a handgun being fired from inside the house. The first responders hit the brakes, doors flying open. They crouched behind their vehicles, calling out through megaphones. "This is the Clinton Police Department. Put the weapon down. Come to the door with your hands visible." No response. A moment later, another shot, then silence. Something was terribly wrong. By the time backup arrived, the entire street was sealed off. Officers took cover behind trees and parked cars as they waited for the tactical team. A soft wind carried the faint smell of gunpowder across the yards, and neighbors were pulled from their homes and escorted to safety. From inside the house, a single voice could be heard shouting in Vietnamese, though no one could make out the words. To the officers outside, it sounded like rage mixed with despair. When dawn began to push through the fog, the house sat under a haze of red and blue lights. The Clinton SWAT unit was called in, along with negotiators trained for hostage crises. But before they could even set up fully, the dispatcher relayed new information. There were children inside. 2 of them. That changed everything. The negotiators switched tactics immediately. They used loudspeakers to try and reach whoever was inside. They told him no one needed to die, that there was still time to surrender, that help was waiting. For a moment, there was no reply. Then a man's voice shouted something back, short, harsh, full of anger. Officers exchanged looks. Whatever was happening inside, it wasn't over yet. As the standoff stretched on, more specialized units arrived, snipers, medics, armored vehicles. The air felt heavy, tense, waiting for a decision that could come at any second. Neighbors gathered behind the police line, wrapped in blankets, watching from a distance as lights flashed against the wet pavement. Nobody could understand how something so violent could erupt here, in a neighborhood known more for backyard barbecues than barricades. Hours passed. The sky turned gray, then pale gold. The negotiators made call after call into the house. Sometimes they thought they heard movement inside, sometimes a muffled voice, sometimes nothing at all. By mid-morning, a breakthrough finally came. The door creaked open for a few seconds, and 2 small figures appeared, children maybe 5 and 2 years old, running into the arms of waiting officers. They were shaken but alive. It was a small miracle in a morning filled with terror. But as one officer carried the youngest child away, he looked back toward the house and saw something in the window, a shape slumped in a chair, motionless. Another lay on the floor nearby. He whispered into his radio, "We've got bodies." When the tactical team finally made entry, hours later, the full horror revealed itself. The living room was in ruins, furniture overturned, bullet holes pockmarking the walls, blood smeared across the floor. 4 adults lay dead, 3 women and 1 man, each killed at close range. The man who had fired the shots was still inside, slumped near a window with a pistol beside him. He was barely alive. His name was Lay Nam. What had driven him to this point? What could possibly explain a man turning a gun on his own family? That question would haunt investigators for weeks, because as they began to piece together what had happened in that small Mississippi home, they would uncover a story that began not with rage but with love and ended with an entire family lost to it. Outside, as the final body was carried from the house, rain began to fall. Light at first, then heavier, mixing with the flashing lights that reflected off the wet pavement. Officers stood silently, soaked to the bone, too tired and too numb to speak. And while the storm gathered over Clinton, the small town began to wake to the news that would shake it to its core. When the officers finally entered the house on Fox Hill Drive, they stepped into a silence that felt heavier than gunfire, the kind that hums in your ears where every movement feels like a violation. They had trained for this kind of chaos, hostage standoffs, barricades, armed suspects, but nothing quite prepares anyone for walking into a home that still looks like people were living their lives only moments before. The air was thick with smoke from gunfire. The television was still playing softly in the corner, some late-night talk show looping through commercials. On the dining table sat 8 pairs of chopsticks, neatly laid out a meal that had never been finished. The chairs were overturned, plates shattered across the floor. The bodies told the story of what happened next. In the living room, a woman lay crumpled beside the couch, her nightgown soaked through. Her face was turned toward the hallway, as if she had been trying to run. In another room, a man lay near the doorway, hands still clutching his chest. Upstairs, 2 more women were found, both shot at close range. The gun, a 9mm semi-automatic, was discovered near the window, where the shooter had made his final stand. Its metal frame was still warm. Nearby lay a box of ammunition half empty. As the forensic team began their work, the house revealed its secrets one piece at a time. Bullet holes in the walls marked the path of rage. Each shot told part of the story. A broken picture frame on the wall, showing a smiling family at a birthday celebration now smeared with dark fingerprints, spoke louder than any report could. One officer whispered to another, "He killed them all. Every single one." The coroner's team began carefully removing the victims. Outside, rain fell steadily, tapping against the hoods of the waiting ambulances. A crowd had gathered behind the yellow tape, neighbors, church members, co-workers. Some were crying quietly. Others stood in shock, unable to process that the kind family who ran the local nail salon had been destroyed overnight. Investigators worked through the morning, identifying each victim by what little they had on them: rings, watches, IDs. But even before confirmation came back from the coroner, detectives already suspected the truth. The victims were all connected. Family. By late afternoon, that suspicion became fact. The medical examiner's report listed 4 names. 30-year-old Lan Thi Van, the wife of the shooter. 28-year-old Lu Thi Van Lan's younger sister. 28-year-old Phuong Minh Lulu's fiancé. And 65-year-old Chi Van, the family's longtime friend and babysitter. Each one had been killed within minutes of the first gunfire. Detectives stood in the rain, staring at the house in disbelief. These were not strangers. They had shared meals, worked together, laughed together. Their lives were woven through the same small community. And the man responsible for all of it, Lê Nam, lay in a hospital bed under police guard, too injured to speak but alive enough to face what he had done. Inside the crime scene van, the lead investigator, a veteran named Captain Morrison, studied the photographs laid out before him. He saw a pattern that was hard to ignore: the family dinner, the neatly arranged table, the close-range gunfire, no signs of forced entry. "This wasn't a robbery," he said quietly. "This was something else." Reporters were already calling it a family massacre, the kind of tragedy that sends ripples across small towns for years. But to the officers who had been there that night, it wasn't just a headline. It was a house filled with the echoes of lives suddenly cut short. As the cleanup team packed up their equipment, one of them noticed something strange in the corner of the dining room. A child's toy, a small stuffed rabbit, was sitting upright on a chair. It was spotless, untouched by the chaos around it. He picked it up carefully, then carried it outside and placed it in the arms of one of the surviving children. The little girl clutched it tight and buried her face against it without a sound. In the following days, news of the tragedy spread quickly across Mississippi. Vigils were held, candles lined the sidewalks, and members of the Vietnamese community came together in mourning. They prayed for the victims, for the two young daughters who had lost their entire family, and even quietly for the man who had caused it. The autopsy results confirmed what everyone already suspected: each victim had died from multiple gunshot wounds fired at point-blank range. The bullets all came from the same weapon. No one had been given a chance to escape. The motive, however, remained a mystery. Le Nam had no criminal record, no history of mental illness, no trace of substance abuse. Friends described him as calm, polite, the kind of man who smiled when you passed him in the grocery store. Nothing about him fit the picture of a killer. But as detectives would soon discover, the cracks in his life had been forming for years, cracks invisible to the outside world, but deep enough to swallow an entire family. And as the investigation stretched into the next week, the question that haunted everyone in Clinton grew louder. Why? Outside, the rain kept falling, soaking into the soft red clay of Mississippi, washing blood from the driveway, carrying it down toward the storm drains. And when night came again, the house stood silent under the streetlights, its windows dark, its walls holding the echoes of everything that had happened inside. By Sunday afternoon, the rain had stopped, but the weight in the air remained. A soft gray light hung over Clinton as investigators gathered at the police station to review everything they had learned from that terrible night. The names of the victims had been confirmed, and each one carried its own story of life, once full of laughter, work, and small dreams that ended too soon. 30-year-old Lon Thi Van, known to friends as Lon, had come to Mississippi years earlier, chasing the same hope shared by countless immigrants, the promise of safety, family, and stability. She was warm, soft-spoken, and kind to everyone she met. Her husband Le Nam had once called her his whole world. Together they had opened a small nail salon called Envy Nail, where the scent of polish and laughter mixed with Vietnamese music playing quietly from the radio. Their salon had become a little piece of home for many. Regular customers said Lan remembered everyone's name, their children, even their favorite colors. She offered tea to elderly clients, made small talk with newcomers, and sent people away smiling. Nobody could have imagined that the woman who spent her days painting beauty into others' lives would one day meet such a horrific end. Her younger sister, 28-year-old Lu Thi Van, had arrived from Vietnam not long before the tragedy. She was shy but hopeful, working alongside Lan at the salon while preparing for her wedding. Her fiancé, 28-year-old Phuong Minh Lu, was finishing his medical residency in Louisiana. That weekend he had driven up to visit her, to talk about wedding plans, to laugh with her family, to dream about the future they would build together. And then, there was 65-year-old Mrs. Chi Van. She had known Lon since childhood, and had moved to America years earlier. When Lon opened her business, Mrs. Chi had volunteered to help care for the two young daughters whenever the couple worked long hours. She had no family nearby, so the Van household had become her home. 4 people, 4 different paths, all bound together by love and trust. The forensic reports confirmed that the victims had been killed within minutes of each other, sometime between 2 and 3 in the morning. The pattern of gunfire suggested that Le Nam had moved through the house room by room. Every shot was fired at close range. There were no signs of hesitation. The police captain stood at the front of the room, his voice low as he spoke. They didn't have a chance. Everyone listening felt the same unspoken thought that this wasn't just a crime scene. It was a family annihilated in their own home. Over the next few days, detectives pieced together who these people really were. They visited the nail salon, still frozen in time. The sign in the window read, "Closed for family emergency." The smell of polish lingered in the air, and near the register, a photo showed Lan and Lu, smiling arms around each other, their faces glowing with quiet pride. Customers came by to leave flowers and handwritten notes. One read, "Thank you for always making me feel beautiful." Another said simply, "Rest in peace, my friends." At the funeral service held at a small Vietnamese Catholic church, on the edge of town, more than 200 people packed into the pews. The air was thick with incense and grief. 4 white caskets stood side by side near the altar, each draped in pale silk. A priest spoke softly in both English and Vietnamese, his voice trembling as he said, "This family brought light into our community. We will remember them, not for how they died, but for how they lived with kindness, humility, and love." The two surviving daughters, ages 5 and 2, were kept close by relatives throughout the ceremony. Too young to understand, they clutched small stuffed animals and stared at the candles flickering near the altar. Their future would now rest with distant relatives far from the home, where their lives had changed forever. As the caskets were carried out, a light rain began to fall again, tapping softly against umbrellas. It felt as though the sky itself was mourning. Back at the police department, detectives continued searching for a reason, something that could explain what had pushed a man like Lê Nam to this point. They knew that sometimes the quietest people hid the deepest storms. They began interviewing neighbors, co-workers, even former customers. The portrait that began to emerge was confusing. Everyone described Nam the same way: calm, polite, helpful. The kind of man who would lend you tools, mow a neighbor's lawn, or repair something for free. He had no criminal record, no history of violence, and no reports of substance abuse. But then a few details started to surface. A neighbor mentioned that police had visited the house before for loud arguments. Another recalled hearing shouting late at night, the kind that ended suddenly, leaving an eerie silence behind. The pattern was faint but real. Something had been brewing in that house long before the gunfire. As night fell, the investigators gathered the last of their notes. Rain streaked down the station windows, and the reflections of the city lights shimmered like small ghosts on the glass. One detective closed his notebook and whispered, "You never really know what's going on behind closed doors." Outside, the town of Clinton began to settle again into uneasy quiet. But the memory of what had happened on Fox Hill Drive would not fade. The house was still sealed, its windows dark, its walls holding the last echoes of that night. And while the community tried to move forward, one question remained. Who was the man who had done this? To understand that, detectives would have to dig into his past to learn how a man once described as gentle and loving could transform into the monster who ended 4 lives before the sun came up. The first thing investigators learned about Lê Nam was that for most of his life he had been invisible in the best possible way. No criminal record, no fights, no arrests, not even a parking ticket. On paper, he was the definition of ordinary: a husband, a father, a small business owner, a man who paid his bills and minded his own business. People who knew him described him the same way every time: quiet, hardworking, reliable, a good man. He'd come from humble beginnings in Vietnam, moving to the United States more than a decade earlier to chase the same dream that had brought so many others a better life for his family. He met Lan through relatives, and from the start they seemed perfectly matched. She was outgoing, friendly, and warm, while he was reserved, thoughtful, the kind of man who avoided attention. When they married, they did what many immigrant couples do: they worked side by side to build something from nothing. Their salon, Envy Nail, quickly became popular. Lan managed clients, while Nam handled repairs and maintenance, sometimes spending hours fixing a single leaky pipe or replacing a broken light fixture just to save the business a few dollars. But underneath the quiet success, cracks had begun to form. Co-workers said Nam had become possessive. He wanted to know where Lan was at all times. When she laughed with customers, his eyes darkened. When she stayed late at work, he waited in the car outside. Some brushed it off as jealousy born from love, the kind that fades with time. But for Lan, that jealousy never faded, it deepened. A few close friends later told police that Lan had confided in them. She said Nam's moods had changed. He was short-tempered, sometimes cold, sometimes distant. Once she'd hinted that he'd raised his voice at her in front of the children. "He's not himself lately," she said quietly. "He worries about everything: the business, the family, me." When detectives checked the family's history, they discovered that the Clinton police had been called to their house twice before, both times for domestic disturbances. Nothing major, nothing violent, at least not on record. The reports mentioned shouting, slammed doors, and one neighbor hearing a child crying. Each time Nam calmed down before officers arrived. No arrests were made. The incidents were written off as marital arguments forgotten by most. But for Lan they were warnings she could no longer ignore. In the months before the shooting, something inside Nam seemed to snap. He became withdrawn, spending long hours alone. He drank occasionally, not heavily, but enough that friends noticed the change. He complained about money, about family expectations, about losing control of his own life. To outsiders, he looked fine. To those closest to him, he was unraveling quietly, piece by piece. When FBI behavioral analysts joined the case, they began constructing a psychological profile of the shooter. The term they used was family annihilator. It's a label reserved for men who destroy the very thing they claim to love most, their families. Statistically, they share certain traits: a deep need for control, a fear of humiliation, and a fragile ego that can't bear the idea of losing status or affection. Reading through the case file, one agent noted Lay Nam fits the profile almost perfectly. He wasn't motivated by greed or revenge. He was driven by a twisted sense of ownership, the belief that if he couldn't keep his family, no one else could either. To understand his actions, investigators retraced the final 24 hours of his life before the massacre. Friday evening, the family had dinner together. Nothing unusual. Afterward, Lan's sister and her fiancé arrived, and the mood was cheerful. They talked about wedding plans, shared photos, laughed. Even the babysitter, Mrs. Chi, later found smiling in those same photos, seemed content. But sometime after midnight, that warmth turned to something cold. Maybe an argument began, something small, maybe about money, maybe jealousy. No one would ever know the exact words. But at 2 a.m, neighbors reported hearing shouting. Moments later, the gunshots began. Forensic analysts mapped the path of each bullet. The first 2 struck Lan in the living room. Her sister, Lu, screamed. Huang, the fiancé, ran toward her and was shot next. Mrs. Chi was found near the hallway, likely trying to reach the children's room. It had all happened in less than 60 seconds. After the shooting, Nam carried his daughters into another room and sat with them. When police arrived, he refused to surrender. For 12 hours he sat in that house, surrounded by death, the sound of rain beating against the windows. When the negotiator finally convinced him to release the children, Nam kissed their foreheads and whispered something no one outside the room would ever hear. Then he returned to the living room and waited. When the sniper's bullet struck him through the chest, he didn't move again. The autopsy confirmed he hadn't been drunk, high, or medicated. His mind had been clear. The act had been deliberate. Detectives later went through his phone. No suicide note, no final message, no clue left behind. Just photos of his daughters smiling, playing in the yard. The last picture had been taken 2 days before the murders. A normal man in every way except for the decision that ended everything. The FBI's final report called it a total collapse of identity under pressure. The words were clinical, but the truth was simple. A man who couldn't face his own fear of loss decided that if his world had to end, he would take everyone he loved with him. In the weeks that followed, the house was torn down. The lot was cleared, the soil dug up, the memory erased as best as it could be. But some things can't be buried that easily. To this day, people who drive through Fox Hill Drive say they still slow down when they pass the empty space where the house once stood. They say the air feels different, they're still heavy, as if it remembers. And for those who lived through that night, it's impossible to forget. But for investigators, one final chapter remained. They needed to understand how a single moment of rage could spiral into 12 hours of violence and terror. And to do that, they would have to relive the siege itself, from the first gunshot to the final command. By the time dawn broke over Clinton, Mississippi, the quiet street of Fox Hill Drive had transformed into something from a war zone. Dozens of police cruisers lined the street. SWAT vehicles were parked at both ends, their lights pulsing red and blue against the mist. Tactical officers crouched behind car doors, rifles trained on the small brick house near the cul-de-sac, the one that had gone from an ordinary family home to the center of an unfolding nightmare. Inside that house sat one man, armed, desperate, and broken. His name was Lay Nam. The first shots had been fired just after 2:30 in the morning. When the first officers arrived, they were met with chaos, shouts, and Vietnamese children crying, and then gunfire from inside. One round struck the windshield of a patrol car, forcing officers to pull back and call for backup. Now hours later, the standoff had entered its fifth hour. Negotiators had established contact, but Nam refused to cooperate. He alternated between angry shouting and chilling silence. The police captain, a veteran named Don Morrison, stood behind the command vehicle, his rain-soaked jacket clinging to him as he spoke into the radio. "He's unstable. Keep the perimeter tight. No one fires unless I give the order." Behind the lines, reporters began to gather, their cameras pointed toward the flickering lights. The air smelled of rain, smoke, and fear. Just before sunrise, the negotiator tried again. He used a calm voice, the kind designed to reach people teetering on the edge. "Nam," he said through the loudspeaker, "we just want to talk. You don't need to do this. Let's make sure everyone gets out safe. Your daughters are okay. We can help you." Silence. Then from inside the house, a voice cracked through the stillness. Harsh, angry, almost childlike in tone. "They're all gone," he shouted. "There's nothing left." The negotiator froze. Those 3 words confirmed what police had feared since the first shots. The family was gone. Still they waited. Hours passed. Rain fell harder. Officers rotated in and out of cover, their uniforms soaked through. Snipers kept their sights trained on the windows, but they couldn't see much beyond the fluttering curtains. At around 9 in the morning, movement. The front door opened just a crack, and 2 small figures appeared, a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, clutching each other's hands. One of them cried out for her mother. Officers shouted for them to come forward. They ran through the rain straight into the arms of a waiting medic. Both were alive, trembling faces streaked with tears and soot. The negotiator took the microphone again. "Nam, your girls are safe. You did the right thing. Now please come out too." No response. For the next 2 hours, police tried everything. Phone calls, pleas from relatives, even broadcasting the sound of his daughter's voices asking him to come outside. Each time, silence. At 11 a.m., a decision was made. If Nam wouldn't surrender, they would have to go in. Tear gas canisters were loaded. Snipers adjusted their scopes. The order was simple: use non-lethal force if possible, but be ready for anything. At 12:15, officers fired the first gas round through a side window. White smoke poured out, curling upward into the rain. From inside, muffled coughing, then another gunshot, one single round that shattered the front window. The sniper positioned on a nearby rooftop saw movement. A figure at the window, raising a pistol. The command was given. One shot rang out. The bullet struck Nam in the chest. He fell backward instantly. SWAT teams breached seconds later, storming through both front and side entrances. Inside, they found him lying near the window, still clutching the handgun. His pulse was weak. Around him, the living room was littered with shell casings and overturned furniture. They moved quickly, clearing each room, calling out police, hands visible. But there was no movement, no sound except the faint crackle of the TV still playing in the background. When the scene was declared secure, medics rushed in to check on Nam. He was barely breathing. They stabilized him and carried him out on a stretcher under a sheet of rain. The scene outside was chaos, reporters shouting questions, neighbors sobbing, officers staring at the ground in disbelief. Hours later at the hospital, doctors confirmed what most already knew. Nam's wound was fatal. Despite every effort, he died of blood loss that afternoon. The siege had lasted nearly 12 hours. In that time, 4 lives had been taken, 2 had been spared, and a small Mississippi town had been forever changed. When the officers finally packed up and drove away, the house stood hollow, its windows shattered, its walls blackened by tear gas. The children's toys still lay scattered on the floor, a grim reminder of what had been lost. As dusk settled over Clinton, rain began to fall again, washing over the driveway, tracing thin red lines that disappeared into the mud. The storm had ended, but the silence it left behind was worse. And in the days that followed, as investigators sifted through what remained of that family's life, a question began to rise, a question darker than any of them wanted to answer. Was this tragedy the result of sudden madness, or was it something that had been waiting to happen all along? When the rain finally stopped, Fox Hill Drive looked like nothing had ever happened there. The police cars were gone, the yellow tape had been taken down, and only a few scattered pieces of glass sparkled in the sunlight. But the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the kind that settles after something too big to understand. In the days after the massacre, Clinton police worked closely with the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation and the FBI to piece together the final puzzle. What they uncovered didn't bring comfort, it only deepened the tragedy. The official report described it clinically. Subject, Nam, male 38, no prior criminal record, no diagnosed mental illness, no history of drug or alcohol abuse. He was by every measure an ordinary man. Stable job, steady income, quiet reputation. But ordinary men can sometimes hide extraordinary darkness. The FBI's behavioral unit categorized the case as a family annihilation event. Their conclusion was as simple as it was horrifying. Nam's motive was not financial, nor was it revenge. It was control. A desperate, suffocating need to hold together a life that he felt slipping away. Experts explained that men like Nam often show no warning signs that outsiders can see. They carry their stress quietly, building pressure in silence until one day it bursts. Behind closed doors, that pressure can become something deadly. In Nam's case, it began with jealousy and isolation. He had grown frustrated sharing his home with his wife's family. The constant noise, the lack of space, the financial strain, it all began to erode him. Friends remembered that he often spoke about needing quiet, needing time to think, but no one imagined how far his thoughts would go. Psychologists who reviewed his behavior noted a pattern common among men who commit family murder-suicides. It isn't rage that drives them, it's despair. A twisted sense of mercy, a belief that ending everything is somehow a way to save everyone from imagined failure or shame. Nam had likely convinced himself that he was sparing his loved ones from a life he no longer believed they could bear. But the truth was much simpler. He had lost control, and instead of asking for help, he turned his pain into violence. The final timeline of events told the story in cold precision. 2:15 a.m. Neighbors hear shouting. 2:20 a.m. First gunshots. 2:30 a.m. Police arrive, gunfire exchanged. 11 a.m. 2 children released. 12:30 p.m. Tactical entry, Nam shot. 3 p.m. Pronounced dead at hospital. Just 12 hours. That's all it took to destroy an entire family. At the funeral held under a gray sky, the air was thick with incense and tears. The Vietnamese community in Mississippi gathered shoulder to shoulder, faces hidden under umbrellas. 4 white coffins sat side by side, surrounded by white flowers and soft candles. A priest's voice trembled through the microphone. No one will ever understand why this happened, but may the rain that falls today wash away the pain left behind. In the front pew, the 2 surviving children sat quietly, too young to grasp the enormity of what they had lost. Their small hands held each other's tightly, eyes wide, unblinking. The congregation wept for them, the only 2 survivors of a tragedy too heavy for words. After the service, people approached the coffins one by one, leaving offerings, rosaries, folded paper, Crane's handwritten prayers. Outside, the church bells rang 12 times. When the last bell faded, an elderly man whispered, "Even when the rain stops, the ground still remembers." Back on Fox Hill Drive, the house remained sealed. A cleanup crew in protective suits worked for 2 days, scrubbing walls, removing floors, repainting. But no amount of paint could hide what had happened there. Residents began crossing the street rather than walking past it. Some swore they could still hear faint crying at night when the wind passed through the trees. Within a few months, the property was sold quietly and torn down. A new house was built in its place, a bright white one with a blue door and a garden of pink azaleas. The new owners never spoke publicly about the home's past, but neighbors said they kept the lights on at night even when no one was awake. For the people of Clinton, the tragedy changed everything. Churches began hosting support groups for families in crisis. The police department partnered with counselors to teach officers how to recognize the signs of domestic breakdown before it turned violent. And each year, on the anniversary of the shooting, the community gathered at the small park nearby to light candles and release white lanterns into the dark Mississippi sky. Each lantern carried a name Lan Lu Fluong and Chi. The last one, small and unmarked, was for the man who caused it all. Some refused to include him. Others said forgiveness is the only way forward. When the final lantern rose and vanished into the clouds, the rain began again, soft and steady. It fell over the street, the park, and the new house that stood where the old one had been. The storm had passed, but the silence remained. And hundreds of miles away in another quiet American town, that same silence would soon settle again, this time in Texas. The morning of December 29, 2023 began like any other in Arlington, Texas. The air was cold, the sky a pale gray, and the streets were still slick from overnight rain. At 10 a.m., most of the city was just beginning to stir, shops, opening engines, starting coffee cups filling. But in a quiet strip mall on New York Avenue, a tragedy was already unfolding. The call came into 911 at 10:05 a.m. The voice on the other end was shaking. "There's a woman on the ground. There's blood everywhere. Someone hit her with a car and drove off." Within minutes, patrol units were racing toward the scene. When they arrived, the parking lot outside a small Vietnamese restaurant called Sun Nam Pho was in chaos. A few stunned bystanders stood frozen near the entrance. Some pointed toward the street where a white SUV had sped away just seconds earlier. Lying near the restaurant door was a woman, motionless, her body twisted at an unnatural angle. The ground beneath her glistened dark red where rainwater and blood had mixed together. One officer knelt beside her, checking for a pulse. There was none. The woman's eyes were open, fixed on the sky, her face pale beneath the cold winter light. The scene told its story in pieces. The driver's side door of a nearby car was open. A purse strap was torn and lying a few feet away. Coins were scattered across the pavement, and a broken phone screen flickered faintly before going dark. This wasn't a simple hit and run. It was something far worse. Detectives arriving on scene noticed something strange right away. Despite the missing purse, a thick wad of cash remained stuffed inside the victim's coat pocket. Robbers don't usually leave money behind. That detail changed everything. The restaurant itself sat silent. The neon sign flickered in the window, still reading open, though it hadn't been unlocked yet. Chairs were stacked neatly inside, waiting for the day to begin. The smell of broth and star anise lingered faintly in the air, mixed now with the bitter scent of rain and exhaust. One of the officers looked up and read the name on the sign aloud, Sun Nam Pho. Then, turning to another, he asked, "Isn't that the place owned by the Thieu family?" It was. The victim's identification wasn't immediately available. Her wallet was gone with the purse, but something nearby offered a clue. A small plastic keychain lay on the ground, cracked but legible. Printed on it in faded red letters were the words Sun Nam Pho, Arlington TX. The officer holding it looked down at the body again. She was middle-aged, Asian, dressed simply as though she had been opening for work. He didn't need more proof. "This is Mrs. Thieu," he said quietly. "It's her restaurant." Her full name was Thu Kim Thieu, though everyone in the community called her Mrs. Kim. She was 56 years old, a mother, grandmother, and the heart of one of Arlington's most beloved Vietnamese restaurants. For years, she had opened her doors before sunrise and closed them long after dark, greeting every customer with a smile. Now, she was gone. Detectives fanned out across the parking lot, looking for cameras. A daycare next door had one facing the area, its red recording light blinking steadily. They would need that footage. As officers placed markers across the scene, something about the tire tracks caught their attention. Black streaks curved sharply across the concrete, ending near where Mrs. Kim had fallen. The pattern wasn't random. It showed acceleration. Whoever had been behind the wheel hadn't just hit her. They had run her over deliberately. Rain began to fall again, light at first, then steadier. Officers hurried to cover the body as photographers worked. Shoppers from nearby stores stood at a distance, whispering in disbelief. One of them, a young woman holding an umbrella, said softly, "She was always so kind, always smiling. Why would anyone hurt her?" Detectives didn't have an answer yet. They only knew that the suspect had fled north in a white SUV, possibly a Dodge Durango. Patrol units across the county were alerted. The search had begun. Inside the restaurant, investigators found small signs of Mrs. Kim's morning routine. Her apron folded neatly on a chair, the register open as if she had been counting cash, a pot of broth still warm on the stove. It was the stillness that made it unbearable. By afternoon, the medical examiner confirmed what police already knew. The cause of death was blunt force trauma from being struck and dragged by a vehicle. As word spread, customers began leaving flowers at the restaurant's door. Notes appeared beneath the windowsill, written in Vietnamese, English, and sometimes both. One read, "We will miss your smile." Another said, "You fed us with love." The following morning, Mrs. Kim's husband Daniel came to the scene. He stood in the drizzle, staring at the spot where she had fallen, his breath fogging in the cold air. Reporters called his name, but he didn't answer. He just whispered quietly. She was on her way to open the restaurant. She loved this place. Behind him, police continued their work, analyzing surveillance footage, tracing tire marks, and collecting fragments of a broken license plate frame left behind in the street. Somewhere in Arlington, the white SUV was still out there, and whoever had been driving it had vanished without a trace. But they wouldn't stay hidden for long. Because what started as a brutal hit and run was about to unravel into something much bigger, an interstate chase, a web of stolen plates, and a suspect who had turned murder into a calculated plan. And before the week was over, that white SUV would lead detectives hundreds of miles south, straight into the heart of Houston. Before she became a headline, before her name filled the evening news, Mrs. Kim Theu was simply known as the woman who made the best pho in Arlington. People would say her broth tasted like memory-rich, warm, and full of something you couldn't quite name. To her customers, she wasn't just a restaurant owner. She was the comforting voice that asked how your family was, the familiar face behind the counter who remembered what you liked to eat. She and her husband Daniel had opened Sun Nam Pho years earlier, with little more than hope and a few handwritten recipes from her hometown in Vietnam. The small restaurant sat between a laundromat and a daycare, unremarkable from the outside, but inside it felt alive. The windows steamed from the simmering pots, the air filled with ginger and basil, and her laughter carried over the clinking of spoons and bowls. Her regulars knew her routine by heart. She opened early every morning, often before sunrise, so she could prepare the broth from scratch. She would hum softly to herself while chopping herbs, occasionally glancing out the window at the sky turning pink. Her husband helped with the deliveries, while their children and grandchildren often stopped by after school, filling the place with noise and joy. She was proud of that restaurant. It wasn't just a business, it was a piece of home. So when she left her house that cold Friday morning, nobody could have known it would be the last time. According to her family, Mrs. Kim had planned a full day. She was heading to a supply store in Fort Worth to pick up fresh noodles and spices, then straight to the restaurant to open by 10. She carried cash in her coat pocket for the morning purchases, as she always did. To her, it was just another normal day. But normal days can turn in an instant. When news spread of her death, the shock rippled far beyond the Vietnamese community. Customers, neighbors, even strangers showed up at the restaurant to pay their respects. The door remained locked, but the front steps became an altar, flowers, candles, handwritten notes piled high beneath the windows. Someone taped a photograph of her to the glass, showing her smiling behind the counter, apron on, hair pulled back, her eyes kind. For many, the loss felt personal. A man named Raymond, a truck driver who had eaten at her restaurant every week for 10 years, told a reporter. She treated everyone like family. You'd walk in, and she'd ask if you'd eaten yet. Even if you were just there yesterday, she'd make sure you left full. Her daughter Jennifer spoke softly through tears during a small vigil. My mom worked every single day, no matter how tired she was. She gave everything to this place and to the people she loved. She was kind to everyone, even strangers. That's the kind of person she was. The rain returned that night, falling steady and soft over the candles. Wax ran down like tears, and the flames flickered in the wind. People stood in silence, the sound of rain filling the spaces between sobs. Detectives continued to work through the night. The keychain found beside the body had confirmed her identity, but the mystery was only deepening. Why had someone attacked her in broad daylight? And why steal her purse but leave hundreds of dollars untouched? As investigators reviewed surveillance footage from nearby stores, they noticed something that sent chills down their spines. On one camera, just minutes before the attack, a white SUV could be seen circling the parking lot. The vehicle slowed, paused near the restaurant, then disappeared from view. Less than 2 minutes later, Mrs. Kim's car pulled into the same spot. When detectives played the footage frame by frame, they saw the SUV reappear moments later, moving quickly toward her. Then the image blurred the camera, catching only chaos movement, a scuffle, and finally the white SUV speeding away. It wasn't random, someone had been watching her. The footage was sent to the regional crime unit for enhancement. Within hours, analysts identified the vehicle as a newer model Dodge Durango. But the license plate number was unreadable. Still, it was enough to build a lead. The next morning, police announced they were searching for a white Dodge Durango connected to the fatal hit-and-run of Mrs. Kim Thieu. They didn't call it murder yet, but everyone knew that's what it was. At the same time, forensic teams finished examining the crime scene. The tire marks showed acceleration, not braking. The trajectory indicated that the driver had aimed directly for her. This wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. Inside the department, the lead detective, a man named Harris, stood staring at the evidence board. The photo of Mrs. Kim smiled down from the top, surrounded by snapshots of the parking lot tire impressions and a single blurred image of the SUV. "She didn't deserve this," he said quietly. "We're going to find who did it." He meant it. Because what nobody knew yet was that the killer's trail wouldn't end in Arlington. It would stretch across counties and cities, a chase through highways, gas stations, and camera footage that would finally lead investigators hundreds of miles south, straight into Houston, and to a man with a history darker than anyone imagined. But for now, the only thing that remained was her memory. The woman who worked through every storm, who fed everyone before she fed herself, and who died just steps from the place she had built with her own hands. Outside the restaurant that night, the rain kept falling soft and endless, whispering against the glass like the voice of a woman everyone loved. When investigators reviewed the grainy surveillance footage from the daycare next to Sun Nam Pho, they didn't expect much. Most cameras in small businesses are old-mounted, high and often too fogged or low quality to catch any real details. But this one, placed above the entrance and angled just right toward the parking lot, gave them a window into the final seconds of Mrs. Kim's life. At first, the screen showed nothing unusual: gray clouds, a light drizzle, the quiet stillness of a winter morning. Then, just after 10 a.m., a white Dodge Durango appeared at the edge of the frame. It rolled slowly past the row of shops, stopped for a few seconds near the restaurant, and then disappeared from view. Moments later, Mrs. Kim's small car pulled into the parking lot. She parked, grabbed her purse, and stepped out, moving toward the restaurant door. She was holding keys in one hand, her coat buttoned to the top against the chill. Then came the blur. The same white SUV re-entered the frame, speeding toward her. The camera shook from the impact. A flash of motion, a scream, and then the vehicle was gone. It had happened in less than 3 seconds. The silence that followed was chilling. The detective watching the footage froze, leaning forward as if getting closer would somehow change the outcome. But it didn't. When the frame cleared again, Mrs. Kim was lying on the ground, her body motionless beside her car. They ran the footage again and again, every replay confirming the same thing: this wasn't random. The driver had been waiting. Detectives immediately began canvassing the area. They pulled footage from gas stations, grocery stores, and traffic lights in a 2-mile radius. Within hours, they had what they needed: a partial glimpse of the Durango, as it left the crime scene heading south on New York Avenue before merging onto Interstate 20. The vehicle's license plate was visible for half a second, just enough for analysts to freeze the frame. When they zoomed in, the numbers were clear. But when they ran the plate through the Texas database, what came back made no sense. The plate belonged to a completely different vehicle, an older model registered to a man in Dallas who had rented a car from Enterprise the week before and returned it the same morning as the murder. He told detectives the rear plate had been stolen sometime overnight. That meant one thing: the killer had swapped license plates. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment crime. It had been planned. The investigation kicked into overdrive. Arlington detectives contacted Enterprise's Dallas and Houston branches, asking for records of every white Dodge Durango rented in the previous week. Out of hundreds of entries, one stood out: a Durango rented 2 days before the murder, in Houston, Louisiana, plates, signed out by a woman, identified only as B. The address listed on her rental contract pointed police to an apartment complex on the city's north side. When investigators called the number she'd provided, it rang 3 times and went straight to voicemail. Meanwhile, back in Arlington, technicians found a small piece of broken plastic near the crime scene, a fragment of a license plate frame. It matched the kind used by Enterprise rental vehicles. Every detail was fitting together. Whoever killed Mrs. Kim had stolen a Texas plate from one rental car and placed it on another to hide the vehicle's origin. Then, after the attack, they drove that same car hundreds of miles back to Houston and swapped the original Louisiana plates back on. It was a level of planning that sent chills through the entire investigative team. By the time detectives traced the vehicle through traffic cameras, it was already too late. The Durango had been recorded, leaving the Dallas-Fort Worth area around noon, then captured 6 hours later near downtown Houston. After that, it vanished. That night, a storm swept across Texas. Heavy rain poured down, washing away tire residue and any remaining traces of the SUV's route. But technology would do what the weather couldn't erase. Over the next few days, Arlington detectives teamed up with Houston police to search for the Louisiana-registered Dodge Durango tied to the rental paperwork. When they finally located it in a parking lot near an apartment complex, they waited in silence, hoping the driver would return. It didn't take long. A young woman approached the car carrying groceries. She looked startled when officers moved in. Her name was Beatrice, but everyone called her B, the same name on the rental form. When they questioned her, she said something that made the entire case twist again. "I didn't do anything," she said, shaking. "I lent the car to a friend. He said he needed it for a day. His name's Pimp." Detectives exchanged looks. The nickname meant nothing yet, but soon it would. Because within hours, they would connect B's friend to a man with a record. A man who had just finished serving time for following people from banks and robbing them at gunpoint. His name was Fernando Taylor. And when detectives pulled his file, what they found would make the motive behind Mrs. Kim's murder finally start to make sense. The woman who had rented the Dodge Durango B sat in the interview room, twisting her hands together, her voice trembling. "He told me it was just for 1 day," she said. "He said he needed to handle some business in Dallas, and he'd bring it right back. He even gave me money to cover the rental. I didn't ask questions." Detectives pressed for a name. What business? What's his real name? B hesitated, then whispered it like a secret she wished she didn't know. "His name's Fernando Taylor, but everyone calls him Pimp." When that name hit the system, the reaction was instant. Taylor wasn't just any suspect. He was a known criminal, 35 years old, recently released from federal prison after serving time for a string of violent robberies. His specialty had been what law enforcement calls jugging, following victims from banks or stores, waiting for the right moment, then ambushing them. He knew how to disappear, he knew how to plan, and he had done this before. Within hours, Arlington detectives were in contact with the Houston Police Department. They pulled Taylor's parole file, mugshot, and vehicle records. Everything pointed to a man who was clever, cautious, and dangerous. Taylor's last known address was a modest house in North Houston. Surveillance units moved in, quietly setting up a perimeter before dawn. The rented white Dodge Durango, the same one that had been seen in the Arlington parking lot, was spotted parked near the complex. Detectives watched as Bee arrived and got into the SUV. They followed her at a distance, lights off through the winding neighborhood streets. When she rolled through a stop sign, officers used it as a reason to pull her over. The stop was calm at first. She handed over her license and rental papers, her voice shaking. But when detectives mentioned Taylor's name, her entire demeanor changed. "He told me not to say anything," she said softly. "He said it was just a job and nobody got hurt." They told her the truth, then Mrs. Kim was dead. The color drained from her face. "Oh my God," she whispered. "He said it was just a robbery. I didn't know he killed her." Bee explained everything she knew. Taylor had contacted her on December 28th, the night before the murder. He said he needed a vehicle that wouldn't be traced to him. She rented the Durango under her name, and he gave her $1,500 for the trouble. When he came back 2 days later, he returned the SUV and gave her another $1,500 to pay off the overdue fees. That payment told detectives something crucial. Taylor wasn't just using stolen plates to avoid being caught on camera. He was trying to erase every trace of the vehicle's connection to the crime. When investigators searched the Durango, what they found sealed the case. In the trunk hidden beneath the spare tire cover, they discovered a piece of broken plastic matching the license plate frame left at the Arlington scene. And inside a small compartment under the driver's seat were 2 crumpled napkins, stained with what appeared to be blood. Samples were sent to the crime lab immediately. The results came back 48 hours later. DNA confirmed the blood belonged to Mrs. Kim Thieu. Detectives finally had what they needed: a suspect, a vehicle, and irrefutable forensic proof. By January 26th, an arrest warrant was issued for Fernando Taylor on charges of capital murder. The Houston Police Department's Crime Suppression Unit and federal marshals surrounded the house where he was believed to be hiding. At 7:45 in the morning, they knocked. "Police, we have a warrant." No answer. Seconds later, the door burst open. Officers flooded inside. Taylor was found in the kitchen, calm, wearing a gray hoodie and jeans. He didn't run. He didn't argue. He just looked at them and said, "You took long enough." As they handcuffed him, one officer asked, "Why'd you do it?" Taylor didn't reply. He just smirked and said, "It was supposed to be easy money." He was taken into custody without incident, transported to Harris County Jail, and later transferred to Tarrant County, where the murder had taken place. During questioning, he invoked his right to remain silent. Not a single word about motive, not a hint of remorse. Detectives could only piece together the rest from evidence. They believed Taylor had followed Mrs. Kim from one of her morning stops, possibly the supply store or a nearby market, watching as she carried cash. He waited until she parked at her restaurant, then attacked. When she resisted, he panicked, hitting her with the SUV before speeding away. It wasn't personal. It wasn't even targeted for who she was. She was simply in the wrong place, at the wrong moment, a random victim in the path of a man who saw opportunity where others saw life. When the news broke that Taylor had been caught, the community of Arlington breathed a collective sigh of relief. But for Mrs. Kim's family, the relief came with a hollow ache. The man who had stolen her life refused to explain why. At a small press conference outside the restaurant, her husband Daniel spoke softly into the microphone. "We prayed for justice," he said. "Now we pray for peace." Behind him, the rain had started again, gentle, steady, falling against the empty storefront window that still bore her photograph. But the story didn't end there. The legal process was just beginning, and the road to justice would be long. Because, as prosecutors prepared their case, they discovered something chilling. This wasn't Taylor's first robbery gone wrong, and if history was any guide, it might not have been his last if he hadn't been caught. The morning Fernando Taylor was arrested, the sun was just beginning to rise over Houston. The air was damp, the sky low and gray, and the streets glistened with leftover rain. For most people, it was an ordinary Saturday. But for detectives who had spent nearly a month chasing him across Texas, it was the end of a nightmare. Taylor had been under surveillance for days. The task force wanted to make sure he didn't run. They watched him come and go from a small single-story house in North Houston, the kind of quiet street where neighbors wave at each other and kids play basketball in driveways. He blended in easily, just another man stepping out to buy coffee or stand on the porch smoking cigarettes. But beneath that calm surface was someone capable of remarkable cruelty. At 7:45 that morning, the command came through the radio. All units move in. The sound of boots hitting pavement broke the stillness. In seconds, officers surrounded the house, a loud knock, followed by the announcement, "Police warrant." There was no movement inside at first, only the faint sound of footsteps. Then the door creaked open. Fernando Taylor stood there in a gray hoodie, calm, unreadable. He didn't flinch when officers raised their weapons. "You took your time," he said flatly. They told him to step outside and get on his knees. He obeyed, hands behind his head, not saying a word. The cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, the metal cold against his skin. One officer later said it was like watching a man who had already accepted what was coming. No panic, no resistance, no surprise. Inside the house, detectives found little: a few pieces of clothing, a half-empty bottle of whiskey, and a duffel bag stuffed with cash. When they opened the bag, they found exactly $1,500, the same amount B had said Taylor paid her after returning the rental SUV. There were also 2 license plates inside the bag, both Texas tags. One of them matched the plate reported stolen in Dallas, the same plate seen on the white Dodge Durango in Arlington on the day Mrs. Kim died. When detectives read Taylor his rights, he stared straight ahead. "You know why you're under arrest?" one of them asked. Taylor shrugged. "Yeah," he said softly. "I heard about that woman. Bad luck, that's all." He didn't look sorry. He didn't even look angry. Just empty. At headquarters, detectives laid out every piece of evidence on the table in front of him: the stolen plates, the blood sample from the SUV, the surveillance photos, the map tracing his route from Arlington to Houston. He glanced at each one with a faint smirk, but said nothing. When asked if he knew Mrs. Kim, he shook his head. "Never met her," he said. "Didn't mean to hurt nobody." "You ran her over," a detective said quietly. Taylor didn't blink. "People panic," he replied. Those 2 words would later become the centerpiece of his silence. They were all he was willing to say. For the next several hours, investigators pushed for details: why he chose her, how he followed her, what he thought in those final seconds. But he refused to elaborate. He invoked his right to remain silent, folded his arms, and leaned back in his chair as if it were all over. But it wasn't. That night, he was transferred to the Tarrant County Jail in Arlington, where he was booked on a capital murder charge. His bail was denied. When the intake officer asked if he had anything to say for the record, Taylor simply smiled. "See you in court." News of his arrest spread fast. Local stations broke into broadcasts with live coverage from the police department. Viewers watched as officers escorted Taylor out in handcuffs, his expression blank under the harsh camera lights. For the Vietnamese community in Arlington, that image was both a relief and a heartbreak. Justice was coming, but so was the realization that nothing could bring Mrs. Kim back. At a press conference later that day, Detective Harris stood before the microphones, rain dripping from the edge of the tent above him. "This was not random," he said. "This was a calculated act. The suspect deliberately disguised his vehicle, followed the victim, and used stolen plates to cover his trail. This was murder." Reporters asked if Taylor had confessed. Harris shook his head. "He's not talking," he said, "but the evidence speaks for him." Behind him, Mrs. Kim's family stood together, holding hands. Her husband Daniel didn't speak to the press. He just looked down, his eyes glassy, his lips trembling, as he whispered something only his children could hear. In the following days, the crime lab confirmed what everyone already suspected: the blood found inside the SUV matched Mrs. Kim's DNA. The partial fingerprints on the steering wheel matched Taylor's. There was no longer any question. When the community gathered again for a candlelight vigil, the tone was quieter this time. There were no speeches, no reporters, just soft music and the sound of rain against umbrellas. Candles flickered along the sidewalk outside the restaurant, glowing like tiny stars in the dark. A small sign taped to the door read "Justice for Mrs. Kim." Inside the closed restaurant, everything remained exactly as she had left it. Her apron still hung on the hook, her glasses folded beside the register. It was as if she might walk in at any moment and tell everyone to stop crying, to sit down to eat. But she never would. And as her family prepared for a funeral, they never imagined having the man responsible sat alone in a cell, silent, expressionless, waiting for his trial. Outside, the rain began again. It always seemed to rain in this story, as if the sky itself refused to forget. When the trial date for Fernando Taylor was announced, the news spread quietly through the Vietnamese community in Arlington. By then, months had passed since the day Mrs. Kim was killed, but time hadn't dulled the ache. Every morning, people still drove past Sun Nam Pho and saw the same image taped to the door, a smiling woman in her apron, her eyes full of warmth. Underneath the photo, candles still burned, though the wax had melted into thick white pools. The restaurant remained closed, but her family couldn't bring themselves to sell it. Instead, they kept it, as it was a small museum of memory. Inside, her coffee mug still sat on the counter, her handwritten notes still pinned near the register, her favorite wooden spoon resting beside the stove. The air carried the faint smell of broth that seemed to linger no matter how long the kitchen stayed cold. For her husband, Daniel, walking through those doors each morning was both comfort and torture. He said he could almost hear her voice calling from the kitchen, almost see her hand on the ladle, stirring the soup she had perfected over years of quiet dedication. But when he turned, she wasn't there. Only the empty chair by the counter, the one she used to sit in, to rest her feet, waited in silence. He refused to move it. Reporters stopped coming after the first few months, but the community didn't. People continued to visit, leaving flowers, cards, and sometimes steaming bowls of pho made at home. They said it was their way of keeping her spirit fed. Meanwhile, in Tarrant County Jail, Fernando Taylor remained silent. Not once did he express remorse. Not once did he explain why. His public defender filed a routine plea of not guilty, citing lack of intent. But prosecutors were confident. They had the vehicle, the DNA, and the surveillance footage that captured everything. During pre-trial hearings, the prosecutor told the court this was not panic. This was precision. Mr. Taylor knew what he was doing, and he prepared for it. Taylor sat motionless, eyes blank. When asked if he had anything to say, he simply said, "No." The judge denied bond and set the trial date for the following year. That meant more waiting, more sleepless nights for Mrs. Kim's family. Her daughter Jennifer described it best in a quiet interview. "It's like time stopped," she said. "We can't move forward until we hear the truth, but the truth might never come from him." In the weeks leading up to the anniversary of her death, the family held a small memorial dinner inside the restaurant. They lit candles and filled the tables with her favorite dishes, spring rolls, rice plates, and of course her pho. Friends and neighbors gathered to eat together, laughing softly between tears, telling stories about the woman who had turned a tiny restaurant into a second home for half the city. A longtime customer stood up and said, "When I moved here, I didn't know anyone. Mrs. Kim made sure I never felt alone. She'd bring me a bowl of soup and say, 'You don't need family to eat here, you have one already.'" The room fell silent and someone whispered, "She still does." That night, as people left the restaurant, the rain started again. It fell gently against the sidewalk, washing away the candle wax pooling around the edges of the memorial. The same rain that had fallen on the morning she died now returned softer, almost forgiving. In Houston, detectives packed up the last of their evidence boxes. The white Dodge Durango sat impounded behind a chain-link fence, its once bright paint dulled by dust and weather. Inside, the stains had faded but never disappeared. Each mark told the story of what had been lost, of a life stolen for nothing more than greed. When reporters asked the prosecutor what kind of sentence Taylor could face, he didn't hesitate. If convicted, he'll spend the rest of his life in prison. Maybe longer. But justice, as everyone knew, would never feel complete. Because justice can't cook another meal, or open the door at dawn, or greet the regulars with a smile. It can't fill the silence that now lives inside that little restaurant on New York Avenue. That silence belonged to Mrs. Kim. It was the sound of her absence, the quiet hum of a place that still remembered her laughter. Outside, the neon sign above the window still flickered faintly. It glowed the same soft red letters she had chosen years ago when she first opened the door's Sun Nam Pho. The light came on every night, even though no one was there to turn it off. And as the rain continued to fall, that faint red glow reflected across the wet pavement, shimmering like a heartbeat that refused to fade. It was a reminder that even when the world moves on, love, kindness, and memory never truly disappear. They just wait like an empty chair beside a window, quietly holding space for the one who once made everything warm. It was the start of summer in 2011 when 26-year-old Michelle Le vanished from a hospital parking garage in Hayward, California. She was a nursing student, known for her kindness, her drive, and the calm confidence that came naturally to people who cared for others. That Friday evening, May 27th, began like any other shift at the Kaiser Permanente Medical Center. Michelle arrived around 7 p.m., carrying her usual tote bag and smiling at the security guard on her way in. She was training for an upcoming rotation, planning to leave early to study for exams later that weekend. Her friends said she looked relaxed, excited even. She had been talking about the future, finishing her degree, traveling, maybe working in pediatrics. But when the end of her shift came, Michelle never made it home. Her coworkers grew worried when her car remained parked on the third floor of the hospital garage long after her shift ended. The lights inside were still on, and her belongings, phone charger, lunch bag, textbooks, were all sitting in the passenger seat. Her phone, however, was gone. When she didn't answer texts or calls, concern turned to fear. Her cousin Christine, who was also her roommate, reported her missing later that night. "She doesn't just disappear," Christine told police. "She's responsible. She calls if she's going to be late. Something's wrong." By the next morning, the Hayward Police Department had launched a full-scale search. Officers combed through the hospital grounds, nearby parks, and surrounding neighborhoods. Volunteers from the nursing school joined in forming lines across open fields, calling her name through the fog. Helicopters circled overhead. For the first 48 hours, hope kept everyone moving. But then small details began to paint a darker picture. Security cameras from the garage showed Michelle walking to her car around 7 p.m., just as she'd told friends she would. She opened the driver's side door, leaned in as if to place something on the seat, and then the footage cut off. No one else appeared on camera. No other vehicle was clearly visible. It was as if she had stepped into thin air. Detectives began to look closer at her personal life, starting with her phone records. The last call made from her phone occurred at 7:04 that evening, just 1 minute after she was last seen. The call had lasted only a few seconds, then nothing. When the cell data came back, investigators noticed something strange. Michelle's phone had traveled 20 miles south toward Fremont before going dark around 7:30. It was moving fast, too fast for someone on foot. That meant someone else was driving. The question was who? Police interviewed her friends, classmates, and family. Everyone described Michelle the same way: driven, thoughtful, kind. She had no enemies, no known relationship trouble. But when detectives asked about her social circle, one name kept coming up. A woman named Giselle Esteban. She and Michelle had once been close friends since high school, even college roommates for a time. But in the months leading up to Michelle's disappearance, something had changed. People said Giselle had grown distant, bitter, jealous. She had a child with a man who had once dated Michelle years before, and though the relationship had ended, jealousy seemed to linger. Christine told investigators Giselle used to talk about Michelle all the time, like she couldn't stop thinking about her. It didn't sound like friendship anymore. When police brought Giselle in for questioning, she seemed calm, almost too calm. She said she hadn't seen Michelle in months, that she was home the night Michelle disappeared, and that she barely kept in touch anymore. But when detectives asked if she'd heard about Michelle's missing phone, her tone shifted. She said quietly, "Michelle's not missing. She's gone." It wasn't what she said, it was how she said it. Cold, certain, like she knew something nobody else did. Detectives walked her to the parking lot after the interview. As she got into her car, one of them noticed a faint scratch on the passenger door, fresh still catching the light. That night, they obtained a warrant to track Giselle's phone records. What they found changed everything. Giselle's phone had pinged off the same cell tower as Michelle's at 7:30 that evening, the exact moment Michelle's phone stopped transmitting. It was too much to be coincidence. As the investigation deepened, friends and family began to gather outside the hospital every night, lighting candles and praying for Michelle's return. Posters went up across the Bay Area, her smiling face printed beside the words, "Missing, please help find Michelle Lee." The community refused to give up, even as the evidence grew darker by the day. And then late one evening, detectives reviewing security footage from a nearby lot spotted something, an image, that would finally confirm their worst fears. A second vehicle, dark-colored, had pulled into the garage minutes before Michelle disappeared. It parked just one level below her car. The make and model matched a vehicle registered to one person, Giselle Esteban. And with that, a mystery that had begun, as a disappearance was about to unravel into something much colder, much more deliberate. Because Michelle hadn't been in the wrong place at the wrong time. She had been hunted. When the sun rose over Hayward the next morning, the search for Michelle Lee entered its fourth day. Volunteers gathered outside the hospital garage, holding maps, flashlights, and coffee cups, determined not to stop until they found her. The air buzzed with tension and hope. But inside the police station, detectives were quietly preparing for a very different reality. Overnight, a new piece of evidence had come in. Michelle's phone, the same one that had gone dark near Fremont on the night she vanished, had suddenly copper great. At first, everyone wanted to believe it. Maybe she had left on her own, maybe she was safe somewhere, overwhelmed needing space. But the tone was wrong. The spelling was off. Michelle's friends said she never wrote like that. She didn't say things like, "Clear my head," Christine told detectives. That's not her voice. When investigators pulled the metadata from the text, their suspicions were confirmed. The message hadn't come from the Bay Area at all. It had been sent hours after her disappearance from a cell tower near Union City, just miles from where her phone last pinged before shutting off. Someone had her phone. And whoever it was wanted to make it look like Michelle had simply walked away. Detectives subpoenaed cell records and tower logs, mapping the path of her phone from Hayward to Fremont to Union City. The movement wasn't random. It followed a route that mirrored a straight line between the hospital and the home of one person, Giselle Esteban. That name kept returning to the center of every circle investigators drew. Meanwhile, Giselle's behavior was becoming stranger by the day. She showed up at a prayer vigil organized by Michelle's family, standing in the back, silent, her face blank. She didn't speak to anyone, didn't join the prayers. One volunteer later said, "She just stood there, staring at the candles. It didn't look like grief, it looked like she was watching something she'd already seen." Police began to monitor her more closely. They learned she had recently been unemployed, struggling financially, and growing increasingly obsessed with Michelle. She told friends that Michelle had ruined her life, that she had taken everything. What she meant by everything was a man. Years earlier, Giselle and Michelle had both dated the same person, a man named Scott. He and Giselle had a child together, but their relationship fell apart. Giselle became convinced that Michelle was somehow to blame. In the months before the disappearance, she had sent Michelle a series of angry messages, accusations, threats, and cryptic lines like, "You don't deserve to be happy." When detectives confronted her about those texts, she shrugged. "I was mad," she said, "but words aren't crimes." No, they weren't. But evidence was. Investigators obtained a search warrant for her apartment in Union City. Inside, they found something chilling, a printed photograph of Michelle pinned to a corkboard, a copy of her class schedule, and notes about her hospital shifts. On the back of one page, Giselle had written in neat handwriting, "She thinks she's better than me." Tucked inside a drawer was another disturbing find, Michelle's nursing textbook, the one she had taken to work the night she disappeared. Her name was written on the inside cover in blue ink. When detectives asked how she'd gotten it, Giselle said coldly, "She left it in my car a long time ago." But that was a lie. Fingerprints on the book's cover matched Giselle's, and the print patterns showed fresh smudges consistent with handling within the past week. By this point, investigators had what they needed to treat her, not as a witness, but as a suspect. The next morning, they brought her in again for questioning. This time, they asked about her whereabouts on the night of May 27th. She repeated the same story: home all night, didn't leave, didn't see Michelle. But when detectives presented the cell tower data, showing her phone traveling along the same route as Michelle's, she went quiet. For the first time, her calm cracked. "I didn't mean for anything to happen," she whispered. The detective leaned forward. "What do you mean, Giselle?" Her voice trembled, almost a whisper. She wouldn't stop. She ruined everything. Then she stopped talking. After that, she asked for a lawyer. When the interview ended, detectives had to let her go while the evidence was processed, but the direction of the case was clear. Michelle's disappearance was no longer a missing persons case, it was a homicide investigation. That night, the search teams gathered again, this time in the rain. Volunteers wore ponchos and carried flashlights, combing through brush along the roads between Hayward and Union City. The sound of rain on their jackets blended with the low hum of engines and the murmur of prayers. Christine walked with them, her voice breaking as she called out her cousin's name. "Michelle, if you can hear us, we're not giving up." But deep down, everyone feared the truth. And the next clue that surfaced would erase all doubt, because somewhere in the digital trail, Giselle thought she had erased, investigators found a single file. A recording. It was a voicemail Michelle had left the night before she vanished, describing a strange feeling she couldn't shake. "She's been following me again," Michelle said softly. "I think it's Giselle." In the weeks after Michelle vanished, detectives began to see a disturbing pattern, a slow unraveling that all traced back to one woman. Giselle Esteban wasn't just jealous, she was obsessed. Friends described her as bright, meticulous, and once full of warmth. But that version of Giselle had vanished long before Michelle did. The woman left behind was bitter, paranoid, and consumed by a rivalry that only existed in her mind. It began years earlier when Giselle and Michelle were still friends in college. They had been close once roommates who shared clothes, traded stories, and laughed about nursing exams. But beneath the surface, jealousy had started to creep in. Michelle was everything Giselle wanted to be: disciplined, respected, and effortlessly kind. Then came Scott. He was charming, confident, and funny, and both women had been drawn to him in different ways. Michelle had dated him briefly before moving on, but Giselle never really let go. When she later had a child with him, she convinced herself that Michelle had somehow ruined what could have been a happy family. The relationship with Scott fell apart. Giselle blamed Michelle for that too. At first, it was just bitterness, comments to friends, subtle jabs on social media. But by 2010, it had turned into something darker. Giselle began following Michelle's online activity, saving her photos, tracking her location check-ins. When mutual friends posted pictures of Michelle, Giselle would send messages asking where they'd been taken, what she was doing, who she was with. She talked about her constantly, one friend later said. It was like she couldn't let her go, like Michelle was living the life she thought she deserved. In early 2011, Giselle's behavior crossed another line. She started sending threatening messages, cryptic, cruel, written in the kind of tone that makes your skin crawl. "You'll get what's coming to you," one text said. Another read, "I'll see you soon." Michelle never reported it. She believed Giselle was angry but harmless. But Giselle wasn't harmless. Detectives recovered hundreds of deleted messages from her phone, many of them written just weeks before the disappearance. The tone grew more erratic, with each one anger mixed with despair, a steady spiral into delusion. She wrote about betrayal, about revenge, about wanting Michelle to understand the pain she caused. When investigators reviewed the voicemail, Michelle had left the night before. She vanished, their suspicions solidified. In that recording, Michelle's voice was calm but uneasy. "She's been showing up at my school," she said. "In the parking lot. I thought I saw her car again tonight. I'm not sure if I'm just imagining things, but it's making me nervous." That voicemail would later become one of the most chilling pieces of evidence in the entire case. A soft warning from a woman who somehow knew her life was in danger. Detectives obtained surveillance footage from the nursing campus and found that Giselle's car, a dark Honda CR-V, had indeed driven through the parking lot multiple times during Michelle's class hours. Each time she stayed just long enough to watch before driving away. It wasn't random, it was stalking. When confronted with this evidence later, Giselle's only explanation was cold. "I just wanted to talk to her," she said. "She wouldn't answer me." But by then the truth was clear. Giselle hadn't wanted to talk, she wanted to punish. In her apartment, investigators found another disturbing detail. On her computer was a folder labeled Michelle. Inside were photos taken from social media, saved emails, and screenshots of conversations. There was even a typed timeline of Michelle's work schedule. Every detail of her life had been documented. The FBI's behavioral unit described Giselle as showing hallmarks of fixation syndrome, a psychological condition where the subject becomes completely consumed by another person, their emotions distorting into an obsession that blurs love, envy, and hatred into something indistinguishable. By the time May 27th arrived, Giselle's obsession had reached its breaking point. Phone records showed her driving toward the Kaiser Hospital that evening, arriving just minutes before Michelle left her shift. Her vehicle parked one level below the third-floor garage. She waited in the car for more than 20 minutes. When Michelle entered the garage, Giselle stepped out. The confrontation that followed was quick and brutal. Forensics would later find faint traces of blood on the passenger side carpet of Giselle's car, blood that matched Michelle's DNA. In the trunk, tiny fibers identical to those from Michelle's clothing were embedded in the lining. After the attack, Giselle drove south, her phone pinging along the same path as Michelle's until both signals went dark near a remote area of Fremont. Their investigators believe she left Michelle's body hidden under brush miles from the nearest road. But at that time, no one knew for sure. And until they found her, the case remained in limbo, a tug of war between hope and dread. Christine continued to organize searches every weekend, even as weeks turned into months. "We're not giving up," she said, her voice steady even when her hands shook. "Someone out there knows something. We're going to bring her home." And they would. But when they finally did, the truth would confirm what everyone feared and what Giselle had tried so hard to hide. Because the woman Michelle once called her friend had become her executioner. The search for Michelle Le stretched into its third week. The posters faded in the sun, candles melted to wax puddles, and volunteers began to show the exhaustion that comes from hoping against reason. But detectives weren't resting. They were quietly building the timeline, one surveillance frame, one data ping, one trace of movement at a time. Every piece of evidence pointed back to the Kaiser Hospital parking garage. That was the last place Michelle had been seen alive. And in that space, 3 levels of cold concrete, echoing with fluorescent hum, something terrible had happened. Investigators returned to the garage again and again, walking the same path she had walked that night. They measured the distance between her parking spot and the elevator. They timed how long it would have taken her to reach her car. They studied the angle of every camera, the shadows cast by the overhead lights. Then one of them noticed something. On a camera positioned near the third-floor exit, just past the moment Michelle disappeared, there was a faint movement in the corner of the frame. A shape blurry, almost ghost-like, moving quickly toward the stairwell. When they enhanced the footage, the shape took form. A woman, her hair tied back, wearing dark clothes, carrying something in her hand. A flashlight. And right behind that movement, the grainy outline of Michelle's car headlights flickering once before turning off. They compared the shape's height and gait to known footage of Giselle Esteban walking into her apartment complex. The match was perfect. Giselle had been there. The discovery confirmed what detectives had already suspected. Michelle hadn't been ambushed by a stranger, she had been lured into a trap. The evidence suggested Giselle had parked one floor below and waited. When Michelle arrived, Giselle followed her up the stairwell, hiding until Michelle reached her car. Then she struck. The confrontation lasted less than a minute. No witnesses heard screams because the thick concrete muffled the sound. When detectives examined the scene with forensic lighting, they found faint traces, tiny drops of blood on the floor near Michelle's parking space, nearly invisible to the naked eye. The lab confirmed it was Michelle's. From there, the story became clearer. Giselle had attacked Michelle, overpowered her, and dragged her body into her own vehicle parked below. She then drove away, disposing of the evidence, and eventually dumping Michelle's phone to throw off investigators. The level of calculation shocked even seasoned detectives. This wasn't impulsive rage, it was premeditated. Back at the station, the lead investigator, Sergeant Kell, stared at the evidence board. On one side was Michelle, smiling bright, full of life. On the other, Giselle, stone-faced, cold eyes hard, even in her booking photos. Between them was a line of red string, connecting phone calls, GPS pings, and parking garage timestamps. Kell whispered to himself, she planned every second. But even with overwhelming circumstantial evidence, they still lacked the one thing that would make the case bulletproof: the body. Without it, prosecutors could argue motive and opportunity, but not proof of murder beyond reasonable doubt. So they kept searching. Volunteers scoured the hills of Fremont and the brush along Palomares Canyon Road, guided by the last cell signal from Michelle's phone. They walked for hours under the hot California sun, wading through tall grass and dry ravines. Each time they found a patch of disturbed earth, they called in forensic teams. Each time it led to nothing. Christine refused to quit. If it were me, she said, Michelle would still be out here looking. By August, 3 months had passed. Giselle had been arrested on suspicion of murder based on the mounting evidence, but she continued to deny everything. Her public defender insisted there was no body, no confession, and therefore no crime proven. In every courtroom appearance, she sat still, emotionless, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The press called her the woman with the frozen stare. Then in September, everything changed. A volunteer search team, using a new mapping grid, began exploring a steep ravine off Vargas Road near Fremont. The terrain was rough, full of dry brush and rock. One volunteer noticed something out of place, a scrap of dark fabric tangled in the weeds. When they looked closer, they saw bones beneath the soil. They called the police immediately. The remains were sent to the Alameda County Coroner's Office. DNA testing confirmed the identity a few days later. It was Michelle Lay. She had been less than 2 miles from where her phone last pinged. The news spread fast. For Michelle's family, the discovery brought both heartbreak and relief. She was no longer missing. They could finally bring her home. When detectives informed Giselle of the discovery, she didn't flinch. She simply looked at them and said, "So you found her." Her voice was flat, no remorse, no surprise. The prosecutor's case was now complete. Every puzzle piece had fallen into place: the jealousy, the stalking, the planning, the attack, and now the proof. And as the trial date approached, the weight of what she had done began to settle like dust over the entire Bay Area. The story of two friends, once inseparable, now bound forever by tragedy, became one of the most haunting crimes California had ever seen. The courtroom would soon become the final stage for a confrontation that had begun years earlier between love and envy, kindness and cruelty, a life lived with purpose and another destroyed by obsession. And when that verdict came, it would reveal not just what happened to Michelle, but who Giselle had truly been all along. When the trial of Giselle Esteban began in Alameda County, the courtroom filled quickly. Journalists lined the back rows, notebooks, open microphones poised. In the front sat Michelle Lay's family, their faces pale from months of waiting, their eyes fixed on the woman who had once been part of Michelle's life. Giselle walked in wearing a navy sweater and glasses. Her hair was tied neatly, her expression unreadable. She looked more like a librarian than a murderer. The contrast unsettled everyone in the room. The prosecutor stood, voice calm but sharp. This case, he began, is not about mystery. It's about jealousy turned into violence. He laid out the evidence piece by piece, the cell phone pings, the parking garage footage, the blood traces found in Giselle's car, and the discovery of Michelle's remains in the Fremont Hills. Each item painted the same picture, a calculated act, driven by resentment, planned over months, executed in minutes. When they played Michelle's final voicemail in court, the room fell silent. Her voice filled the air, soft, uneasy, describing the feeling of being watched. "She's been following me again," Michelle had said. "I think it's Giselle." Even the jurors seemed to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Giselle's defense attorney argued that the evidence was circumstantial. "There's no eyewitness," he said. "No one saw what happened. There's no confession." He suggested the confrontation may have been an accident, a fight that went too far. But the prosecution countered with cold precision. They showed text messages Giselle had written in the weeks before the killing, angry, bitter, full of venom. "She deserves to suffer," one read. Another said, "I'll make sure she never laughs again." And then there was the most damning piece of all, a recorded conversation Giselle had with a friend days before Michelle disappeared. When asked if she still hated Michelle, Giselle laughed and said, "You'll see. Soon." The courtroom gasped when that tape played. Giselle didn't blink. Through it all, she sat still, no tears, no outbursts, just the same blank stare that had haunted every photo since her arrest. Michelle's cousin Christine took the stand next. Her voice trembled as she described the search, the sleepless nights, the moment they found her cousin's remains. "She didn't deserve this," Christine said softly. "She was good to everyone, even her." Reporters wrote that her words pierced the silence like a knife. The forensic experts followed. They described the blood evidence, the fibers, the GPS data. Each fact landed like a hammer, building a structure no defense could tear down. By the time closing arguments arrived, the story was complete. The prosecutor's final words were simple. Giselle Esteban planned Michelle Lee's death. She waited, she hunted, and she carried out her plan. That is not rage. That is intent. When the jury left to deliberate, the room emptied into the hallway. Michelle's family huddled together, holding hands. Outside it had started to rain again, thin drops streaking down the courthouse windows. Reporters whispered about the symbolism: rain at the beginning of the case, rain now as it reached its end. The deliberation lasted less than 4 hours. When the jury returned, every sound in the room stopped: the shuffle of feet, the clicking of pens, the faint hum of air conditioning. The clerk stood and read the verdict. On the charge of first-degree murder, guilty. Michelle's family wept quietly. Her cousin closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you." Giselle didn't move. She didn't flinch. She didn't look at anyone. She just sat there, her eyes fixed forward, lips pressed into a thin line. When the judge asked if she wished to make a statement before sentencing, she shook her head once and said no. The judge's voice was firm but weary. "This crime was deliberate and cruel. You have taken a life and devastated a family. For that you will spend 25 years to life in prison." As the deputies led her away, the echo of their footsteps filled the room. Michelle's mother clutched her daughter's photo to her chest, tears falling onto the glass. Outside reporters called out questions: why, how, what made her do it? But Giselle didn't answer. She never would. Her silence became part of the story, a chilling punctuation mark to a tale already soaked in obsession. For Michelle's family, the verdict brought justice but not peace. "We have closure," Christine told the crowd outside the courthouse. "But closure doesn't mean healing. Healing takes a lifetime." That night, the city of Hayward was quiet. Rain fell softly on the streets, and candles once again flickered outside the hospital where it all began. Volunteers lit them, not out of hope this time, but out of remembrance. And somewhere beyond the courthouse in the hills where she was found, the wind moved gently through the grass. The sound was faint but constant, like breathing, like peace returning after too long an absence. Michelle Lay was gone, but her story had finally been told. The cemetery sat on a small hill overlooking the San Francisco Bay. The air smelled of salt and damp earth, and the fog rolled low across the grass, curling around the headstones like breath. It was early morning quiet, except for the soft hiss of the wind through the trees. Michelle Lay's family stood gathered under a white tent, their black coats glistening with dew. Her mother held a small bouquet of lilies, the same kind Michelle had loved to keep in her apartment, always fresh, always bright. Her brother placed his hand on her shoulder as the priest began to speak. "We lay Michelle to rest today," he said softly, "but her light is not gone. It lives in the love she gave, the lives she touched, and the lessons her story leaves behind." For a moment the words hung there, fragile as glass. Then the sound of quiet sobbing filled the air. Michelle's cousin Christine stepped forward to speak. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear. Michelle was the kind of person who believed people could be better, she said. Even when someone hurt her, she tried to forgive. She wanted peace. She never thought someone she once called a friend could be the reason she's gone. She looked up toward the sky, her eyes red. We've learned something from her life, even from her death. That kindness doesn't mean weakness and trust doesn't mean blindness. But still, Michelle would want us to forgive. There was silence again, except for the wind moving gently through the trees. The family lowered the white casket into the earth. It was simple, beautiful, draped with a single white cloth embroidered with a cross. As the priest prayed, Christine dropped a handful of lilies into the grave. They landed softly on the lid, a whisper against the wood. In the weeks that followed, people from across the Bay Area came to visit her grave. Some brought flowers, others brought letters. A few left stethoscopes or small nursing pins as tokens of the life she never got to finish. Her classmates created a scholarship in her name, dedicated to nursing students who embodied her compassion and quiet strength. They called it the Michelle Le Memorial Fund. At the hospital where she had once worked, a framed photo of her was placed in the main lobby next to a small plaque that read, "In memory of a healer whose kindness reached everyone she met." And every year since, on the anniversary of her death, the nurses there light a single candle beside her picture. The flame flickers through the night shift until dawn, when the morning staff arrives and the world begins again. But for those who knew her best, the wounds never fully closed. They remembered her laughter, her determination, her habit of leaving encouraging notes on coworkers' lockers. They remembered how she used to say, "No matter how hard the shift gets, someone needs your care more than you need your rest." That's the kind of person she was always giving, even when she had nothing left to give. For detectives, the case became a reminder of something deeper, that the worst crimes don't always come from strangers in the dark. Sometimes they come from people we once trusted, people we thought loved us. The quiet ones who let jealousy grow until it becomes something monstrous. Giselle Esteban began her life sentence at a California state prison. She never spoke publicly about the crime, never apologized, never explained. Her silence remained absolute, as if acknowledging what she'd done would make it real. But in the end, her silence didn't matter. The truth had already spoken for her. Michelle's story found its place in true crime history, not because of the brutality, but because of the resilience of those who refused to stop searching for her. Christine and the volunteers who combed the hills, the officers who refused to give up, the strangers who showed up, day after day, they carried her home when she couldn't find her way back herself. On the first anniversary of her funeral, Christine returned to the same spot on the hill. The fog was thick again, the grass wet beneath her shoes. She knelt beside the headstone and placed fresh lilies there. The stone read, "Michelle Lay 1985-2011, beloved daughter, sister, friend." She stayed there a long time, listening to the soft hum of the city, far below the faint sound of cars moving through the mist. Then she whispered, "We found you. You're home now." A light drizzle began to fall, tiny drops clinging to the flowers. The rain was quiet, gentle, the kind that makes the air feel alive. As Christine walked back toward her car, she glanced once more at the grave. For a moment, it looked as though the fog had lifted just enough for the morning sun to touch the stone. And then it was gone. That was the lesson of Michelle Lay's story. That light, even when taken too soon, never truly disappears. It just moves quietly, patiently into the hearts of those who remember. It was a cool October night in 2005 when 37-year-old Christy Wilson walked out of the Thunder Valley Casino in Lincoln, California, and disappeared forever. The casino lights burned bright against the dark foothills, their neon glow cutting through the night. Inside, the slot machines hummed, the cards snapped, and the laughter of gamblers echoed across the floor. But by the time midnight rolled around, that energy began to fade, replaced by something far colder. An unease that would soon grow into one of the most haunting missing persons cases the county had ever seen. Christy had gone to the casino after dinner with friends just for a little fun. She was outgoing, sharp, and fearless, a woman with a quick wit and a loud laugh that drew people in. She'd grown up in the Bay Area, worked in finance, and was known for her independence. To her friends, she was the kind of person who never stayed quiet if something felt wrong. That night, she'd been winning small amounts at the blackjack tables, chatting easily with other players. One of those players was a man in his early 50s, dressed neatly, polite, but reserved. He introduced himself as Mario Garcia. They talked casually for a while, nothing out of the ordinary. Surveillance footage showed them laughing, leaning toward each other as the game went on. Around 11:45 p.m., Christy stood, collected her chips, and the two walked together toward the exit. That was the last time anyone ever saw her alive. When Christy didn't show up for work the next morning, her friends called her cell. It went straight to voicemail. They checked her apartment, no sign of her. Her car was still parked outside the casino, locked her purse inside. By the following day, police were treating it as a missing person case. The surveillance footage from Thunder Valley quickly became the centerpiece of the investigation. It showed Christy leaving the casino with Garcia at exactly 11:48 p.m. They walked across the parking lot together toward his car, a dark-colored Toyota. After that, the cameras lost them in the shadows. But what happened next wasn't visible on any screen. The next morning, detectives went to Garcia's home in Auburn, about 15 miles away. He lived alone on a quiet rural property, a large house set back behind iron gates. When they knocked on the door, Garcia answered calmly, wearing a pressed shirt, his hair neatly combed. "Yes," he said, "I was at Thunder Valley last night. I met Christy. We played blackjack together. She left before I did." He smiled politely as he said it. Too politely. Detectives asked if they could look at his car. He hesitated for just a moment before saying, "Of course." The Toyota sat in his driveway, spotless at first glance. But when investigators opened the door, they saw something odd: scratches on the passenger side panel and a faint reddish stain on the seatbelt. When they lifted the floor mats, they found strands of blonde hair tangled in the carpet fibers. Garcia's expression didn't change. "People spill drinks," he said. "She probably dropped something." But the look in his eyes told a different story. When forensic testing came back, the results were conclusive. The hair and blood matched Christy Wilson. Detectives returned to his house the next day with a search warrant. They combed every inch of the property, his garage, his shed, his backyard, even the pond near the edge of his land. They found more hair strands, pieces of fabric, and a torn fragment of a fingernail. And yet there was still no body. Without it, they couldn't prove murder. But the evidence was strong enough for an arrest. On October 20th, 2005, Mario Garcia was taken into custody and charged with kidnapping. As the case grew, that charge would later become murder. At his arraignment, Garcia stood tall and expressionless. "I didn't kill anyone," he told reporters. "This is a mistake." But investigators knew better. They had found something in his background that made the case even darker. Years earlier, Garcia had been accused of attacking another woman near the same area, grabbing her by the hair and forcing her into his car. She escaped by jumping out at a red light. The case had been dropped for lack of evidence. Now with Christy gone, that old story didn't look like coincidence anymore. In the weeks that followed, volunteers searched the hills and ravines around Auburn. Helicopters scanned the area, dogs combed the property, and family members handed out flyers with Christy's photo. Her mother's voice cracked as she spoke to the news cameras. "Please," she said, "bring my daughter home." But no one did. The only person who knew what happened was Mario Garcia, and he wasn't talking. As the months passed, the case moved from missing person to cold file. But her family never stopped searching. And 15 years later, long after most had given up, the ground itself would give them the answer they'd been waiting for. Because the truth, as it turned out, had been buried all along, waiting in silence beneath the soil of the very property where she had last been seen. When detectives arrested Mario Garcia, the first thing they noticed were the scratches on his face. 3 long marks ran from the side of his jaw to just below his ear, thin but deep enough to have drawn blood. He said they were from his dog. The detectives didn't believe him. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of the interrogation room, the scratches looked raw, fresh, angry. The timing matched the night Christy Wilson vanished. When they asked about them again, Garcia's tone shifted from polite to defensive. "I told you," he snapped, "my dog jumped on me." But he didn't own a dog. For investigators, that small lie was confirmation of something much darker. Christy had fought back. They knew it because of what they'd found inside his car: the torn fabric, the strands of blonde hair, the tiny fragments of broken acrylic nails. Every mark in that vehicle told the same story. A struggle, a desperate fight. Detectives began piecing together Garcia's life. On the surface, he was everything a neighbor might admire: educated, successful, quiet. He'd worked as an engineer for a large construction company and volunteered at church events. He smiled easily, spoke softly, and kept his lawn trimmed with precision. But his past held secrets few people knew. Back in 1998, he had been accused of violently assaulting another woman after a night at a local bar. She'd escaped his car and run to safety. When police questioned him, he said it was a misunderstanding. The charges were dropped. That incident, buried for years, resurfaced now with haunting familiarity. Garcia was the kind of man who lived behind masks, one for his neighbors, one for his co-workers, and one for the women he met alone. As the case against him grew, detectives searched his house inch by inch. They found rope in his garage, duct tape in his truck, and a shovel with dirt still clinging to the blade. Nothing alone proved guilt, but together they formed a chilling mosaic. In one drawer, they found a folder filled with printed photos of women he'd met at casinos and social events. Christie's picture wasn't there, but the pattern was unmistakable. He collected images of women like trophies. When investigators confronted him with the blood evidence found in his car, his confidence cracked. "That can't be hers," he said. "You're trying to frame me." The detective leaned forward. "Her DNA doesn't lie, Mario." He looked away, breathing heavy. "Then she must have cut herself," he muttered. "She was drunk." She wasn't. Her toxicology report later showed no alcohol in her system. In the weeks after his arrest, Garcia's mask of civility slipped further. In recorded phone calls from jail, he lashed out at reporters, accusing the media of ruining his reputation. "They're making me out to be a monster," he said. "I didn't kill anyone." But behind those denials, there was a quiet arrogance, the kind that comes from believing you're too clever to be caught. At trial, prosecutors laid out the evidence with ruthless clarity. The last person seen with Christy Wilson was Mario Garcia. Her blood and hair were found in his car. He bore injuries consistent with a struggle. His story kept changing. And most damning of all, the property around his home matched the last cell tower pings from Christy's phone. The defense tried to sow doubt. They argued that Christy could have left with someone else after Garcia, that she might still be alive somewhere. They said there was no body, no proof of death. But the jury wasn't convinced. After 3 weeks of testimony, the verdict came back guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted, tears from Christy's family, disbelief from Garcia's supporters. He showed no emotion as the judge read the sentence, 59 years to life. The judge's final words echoed across the room. You have shown no remorse, Mr. Garcia. You took a life and you have refused to give this family peace. You will never walk free again. Still, the case felt incomplete. There was no closure, no grave to visit, no proof of where she'd been left. Her family sat in the front row of every hearing, praying he would one day tell them where she was. But Mario Garcia stayed silent. Years passed. His hair turned gray. He was transferred from one state prison to another, living out his days in a cell far from the hills of Auburn. Then, in 2015, years after Christy Wilson vanished, detectives received a call from the new owners of Garcia's old property. They were doing renovations, clearing the land near an old outbuilding. The ground radar had detected something buried deep beneath the soil. It wasn't a pipe, it wasn't debris, it was shaped like a human body. Police arrived within hours, setting up tents, floodlights, and crime scene tape around the area. The excavation took nearly a full day. When they reached the object, the forensic team uncovered bones fragile, yellowed with time, but unmistakably human. They found clothing fragments beside the remains, entangled within the soil, a gold bracelet with the initials CW, engraved in small letters. DNA confirmed what the family had long known in their hearts. It was Christy Wilson. 15 years of waiting, 15 years of wondering, and now finally an answer. When the news reached the prison, Mario Garcia said nothing, not a word. He died later that same year, never admitting what he'd done, never explaining why. But the earth had spoken for him. It had given up the truth he'd tried to hide. And for Christy's family, that truth was everything. Because even when justice comes late, it still comes. When the excavation team confirmed that the remains found on Mario Garcia's former property belonged to Christy Wilson, the story that had haunted Placer County for 15 years finally came full circle. But for detectives who had worked the case from the beginning, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like uncovering an old wound that had never truly healed. Christy's family gathered quietly at the site that afternoon. The old wooden gate still bore the rusted initials MG carved into it. The land stretched out behind the house, wild now, with weeds and oak trees. In the soft light of late summer, it looked peaceful. Too peaceful for the horror buried beneath. Her mother stood near the excavation site, watching as the last pieces of soil were sifted through and collected. She whispered, "You're home now," her voice trembling but steady. For 15 years, she had spoken those words into the wind, into empty fields, into her prayers. This time, they finally reached her daughter. Investigators marked the spot where the grave had been found, about 30 yards from the edge of Garcia's back porch, beneath what had once been a small vegetable garden. The forensic team said the burial was shallow, hurried, covered in layers of gravel and clay. It was the kind of grave made by someone who believed they'd gotten away with it. For years, Garcia had tended that same garden, planting tomatoes and herbs over the place where he had hidden her. He cooked with that food. He entertained guests on the patio above it. He lived his life surrounded by the evidence of his crime. It was the final cruel detail in a life built on lies. After his death in 2020, a new set of detectives began piecing together the parts of Mario Garcia's past that had been forgotten or ignored. What they uncovered painted the portrait of a man who had lived in the shadows for decades, always one step away from exposure. In the early 1990s, Garcia had lived in the Bay Area, where he worked as a project manager for a large construction firm. He was intelligent, meticulous, and known for his charm. But quietly, he had also been accused of harassing female co-workers, subtle at first, then increasingly aggressive. When one woman reported him, the company asked her to transfer rather than confront him directly. A few years later, the incident near Auburn followed. A woman had met Garcia at a restaurant thinking he was kind. He offered her a ride home. Instead, he drove to a secluded area and tried to force her out of the car. She escaped by clawing at his face and leaping from the moving vehicle. He was arrested but released when she refused to testify. Fear kept her silent, and Garcia walked free. That pattern, control, manipulation, and silence defined his life. He wasn't impulsive, he was calculated. He learned how far he could push before people broke, and he always made sure there was just enough doubt to keep him safe. When he met Christy Wilson at Thunder Valley Casino, it wasn't fate, it was selection. He saw her laughing, confident, unafraid, and decided that she was the next woman he could control. He had done it before. He believed he could do it again. But Christy fought back. The scratches on his face told the story of her courage. The blood in his car proved her defiance. Even in her final moments, she had left behind the clues that would one day reveal his guilt. In the years after Garcia's conviction, before the body was found, he lived out his sentence in near isolation. Guards described him as quiet, meticulous, and distant. He read constantly, law books, philosophy, even religion. He told one chaplain that he had been wrongly judged, that people misunderstood his desire for control. Those words chilled the chaplain. Desire for control, that was his confession buried in arrogance. When Garcia died in prison from natural causes at the age of 65, there was no funeral, no obituary, no family waiting to claim his remains. His ashes were unceremoniously scattered by the state. But his death gave police the opportunity to revisit his life without legal barriers. They began examining cold cases involving missing women within a 50-mile radius of his former home. Several unsolved disappearances shared eerie similarities. Women leaving late-night venues, their cars found abandoned traces of struggle nearby. Nothing could be proven yet, but investigators believed Garcia might have been responsible for more than Christie's murder. He had simply been good at hiding it. When the final forensic report on Christie's remains came back, the medical examiner confirmed what her family had always feared. She had died of blunt force trauma, likely during a violent struggle. Her mother wept when she heard those words, but there was peace beneath the grief. She fought, she said softly. My baby didn't go quietly. In a small ceremony months later, the family held a proper burial for Christy. This time there was no press, no flashing cameras, just family, friends, and the sound of wind moving through the pine trees. A friend placed a small plaque at the base of her headstone. It read, "Found at last, loved forever." And though Mario Garcia was gone, his story didn't end there. His crimes, his patterns, and his darkness left behind something. Even he couldn't control a trail of evidence that investigators believed might reopen old wounds and bring answers to families who'd been waiting just as long. The shadows he left behind still lingered, but for Christy Wilson, the light had finally reached her. And in that light there was truth. Long before Christy's remains were found, her family had already endured the impossible, a murder trial without a body. In 2006, less than a year after her disappearance, prosecutors faced one of the hardest challenges in the justice system, proving that a woman was dead without having the physical proof to show it. The courtroom in Auburn was packed when the trial began. Reporters lined the walls, camera crews waited outside, and Christy's family sat quietly in the front row holding each other's hands. Every day they stared at the man accused of killing her, the same man who had walked out of the casino by her side that October night. Mario Garcia entered the courtroom in a dark suit, his posture straight, his expression calm. He nodded to his attorney, glanced briefly at the jury, and sat down. Not once did he look toward Christy's family. The prosecutor began with a simple, heavy truth. "You will not see a body in this case," he said, "but you will see everything else, the blood, the hair, the scratches, the lies. You will see the pattern of a man who thought he could erase a life and walk away." The evidence told a story that didn't need a body to make sense. Garcia's car had been cleaned the morning after Christy vanished, but not well enough. Forensic teams found microscopic traces of blood in the seams of the passenger seat, hair strands under the floor mats, and a small piece of broken acrylic nail lodged near the console. The DNA matched Christy Wilson. On Garcia himself, detectives photographed scratches across his face, arms, and hands, fresh wounds inflicted the same night she disappeared. He said they were from his dog, but when police searched his property, they found no dog, no doghouse, no evidence of one ever living there. Then came the digital trail. Cell tower records showed both Garcia's and Christie's phones, traveling together from the casino to Auburn before Christie's signal went dead near his property. Her car remained at the casino, her purse inside her phone missing. The jury listened to every detail, each fact adding weight to the next. But the moment that silenced the entire courtroom came when prosecutors revealed what Christie had done before she vanished. She had told her friends, "If anything ever happens to me, it'll be because of someone I meet at that casino." She said it half jokingly, but her words now felt prophetic. The defense tried to create doubt. They argued that Christie might have left voluntarily, that perhaps she'd met someone else after leaving Garcia. They said the evidence was circumstantial, that DNA didn't prove murder, only contact. But the prosecution dismantled that idea piece by piece. If she left, the prosecutor said, then where did she go? Her car was left behind. Her purse, her phone, her keys. People don't vanish into thin air. They are made to vanish. Over the next several weeks, the courtroom became a battlefield of logic and emotion. The prosecution presented Garcia as a manipulative predator, a man who preyed on women, controlled them, and discarded them when they resisted. The defense painted him as a misunderstood gentleman, unlucky to be the last person seen with a missing woman. But there was one thing even the defense couldn't explain: the blood. A forensic specialist testified that the droplets found inside Garcia's car were not transfer stains. They were cast-off patterns, meaning the blood had been flung from an object in motion. It wasn't the result of a nosebleed or a cut finger. It was the result of violence. By the time closing arguments arrived, the jury didn't need to be convinced. They had already made up their minds. The prosecutor's final words were quiet but devastating. Christie Wilson is gone. Mario Garcia knows exactly where she is, but he will never tell us. So we must speak for her. We must say what she can't, that he took her life and buried it in silence. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days. When they returned, the courtroom went still. The judge asked for the verdict, and the foreman stood. Guilty of first-degree murder. Christie's mother cried softly, her hands trembling. Reporters scribbled furiously. Garcia stared straight ahead, expressionless, his jaw tight. Before sentencing, the judge gave him one final chance to speak. "Mr. Garcia," he said, "is there anything you wish to tell this court, any truth you'd like to share before judgment is passed?" Garcia looked up slowly, his voice calm. "I didn't kill anyone," he said. "You're all making a mistake." The judge nodded once. "So noted." Then came the sentence: 59 years to life in prison. The gavel struck, echoing across the room like the sound of a door closing. Outside the courthouse, Christie's family faced the cameras with quiet strength. Her mother said, "We didn't find her, but at least we found justice." At the time, no one knew that justice would eventually bring more than a verdict. 15 years later, when her remains were unearthed, that verdict would transform into absolute truth. Even without a confession, even without a body, the evidence had told the story exactly as it happened. And while Garcia spent his final years behind bars, never admitting what he'd done, the land he thought would keep his secret had refused to stay silent. It had held on to the truth, waiting for the day it would finally be revealed. For 15 years, the Wilson family lived in that painful space between truth and closure. They knew Mario Garcia had killed their daughter. The jury had believed it. The evidence had proven it. But without her body, part of them still waited, still wondered, still hoped that maybe one day they could bring her home. That day finally came in November of 2020. The new owners of Garcia's former property had been renovating the land, leveling an old outbuilding, laying pipes, preparing to plant new trees. As the bulldozer tore through a patch of uneven ground near a cluster of oaks, the driver noticed something odd. The soil below was darker, packed differently than the rest. When the machine scraped across it, the metal blade hit something solid. He stopped immediately. At first, he thought it was a rock. Then he looked closer. It wasn't a rock. It was a human bone. Within hours, the property was swarming with police forensic teams and news crews. Yellow tape fluttered in the breeze, marking off the place that had once been Mario Garcia's private sanctuary. Now it was a crime scene again. The dig went slowly. The earth was dry, hard, resistant. But piece by piece, the truth came up from the ground. Bones, clothing, fragments, a pair of earrings, a thin gold bracelet with the initials C.W. etched on its side. The same bracelet Christie's mother had given her for her birthday the year before she disappeared. The air grew heavy with silence as the last layer of soil was cleared. Everyone standing there understood what they were seeing. After 15 years, Christy Wilson had been found. The coroner's office confirmed her identity through DNA testing, matching it to samples her mother had provided more than a decade earlier. The official cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma. The depth of the grave, barely 2 feet, and the way her remains were positioned told investigators that Garcia had buried her in haste under the cover of darkness, thinking the earth would keep his secret. But the earth remembered. When the family received the call, Christy's mother wept so hard she could barely speak. "We've been waiting for this moment," she said through tears. "Now my baby can rest." In a small press conference outside their home, her brother stood before cameras and said quietly, 15 years. 15 years she was right there, hidden under his garden. He thought he won, but she's home now. The discovery reignited public outrage. People who had followed the case since 2005 wrote messages online. She never stopped fighting. He couldn't hide her forever. Justice always comes, even if it takes a lifetime. For the detectives who had worked the case, it was deeply personal. Some of them were retired by then, others had transferred to new departments. But when the news broke, many came back just to stand by the excavation site to see for themselves that the story was finally complete. One of them, Detective Mike Ramsey, spoke quietly to a reporter. "We never stopped looking. Every few years we'd drive past this place and wonder. She was here the whole time. The ground was keeping her safe until we were ready to find her." The house itself was unremarkable, now its paint faded, its windows fogged from age. The new owners had no connection to Garcia, no idea of the horror that had taken place there. When they learned what had been buried under their feet, they broke down in shock. "We just wanted to plant trees," one said. "We never imagined we'd uncover someone's daughter." As the remains were carried out on a stretcher, the sun began to set. It painted the fields gold, the same color as Christie's hair in the photos her family had kept framed for years. The crowd stood in silence as the van doors closed. There were no words left to say. In the following weeks, Christie was given a proper burial. Her casket was white, her grave lined with flowers. Her mother whispered the same words she'd spoken 15 years before, but this time they were final. "You're home, sweetheart." Mario Garcia never saw that moment. He had died earlier that same year alone in prison. He took his secrets with him, but the ground he'd trusted betrayed him in the end. As one detective said later, he thought he'd buried her. But what he really buried was his own freedom, his own soul. The Wilson family found peace at last. Not the kind that erases pain, but the kind that lets you breathe again. They planted a single oak tree near her grave, a symbol of endurance, of patience, of truth that survives even in darkness. Each spring, when the leaves return, her mother visits and sits beneath that tree, listening to the wind move through the branches. Sometimes she talks to Christy, telling her how the seasons have changed, how the world has moved on, how she's missed her every day since that night at Thunder Valley. And every time she leaves, she turns once more to look back at the grave and whispers, "You were never forgotten." Because the truth of Christy Wilson's story is that even the deepest silence can't hide forever. It only waits until love digs deep enough to find it. It's late now. The lights are low and outside the rain has started again. The kind of steady, quiet rain that fills the air with memory. It taps against the windows, soft but relentless, the same sound that's followed every story we've told tonight. The stories of people who began their evenings like any other, working, driving, laughing, living, and never came home. The ones who trusted love, trusted friendship, trusted safety, and paid the price for it. Michelle Christie Lan and Mrs. Kim. 4 women, 4 lives, 4 storms. Each taken by someone they knew, someone who once claimed to care for them. Each one a reminder that darkness doesn't always live far away. Sometimes it sits quietly beside us, smiling, waiting for a moment to move. These cases stretched across states, across years, across cultures. But they all shared one truth: evil rarely looks like evil when it walks through the door. It wears ordinary faces, speaks softly, laughs at the right moments. It hides behind love, jealousy, greed, and pride. But even against that darkness, something else endures: the people who refuse to give up. The detectives who dig through mud and memory. The families who stand outside in the rain holding candles long after the cameras leave. The volunteers who walk miles through fields whispering names into the wind. They're the reason these stories don't fade. Justice, when it comes, is never clean. It doesn't erase the pain or bring back the light that was lost, but it steadies the air. It gives the living a place to stand again. And in every one of these stories, that's what remained: the love that outlasted the crime. Michelle's laughter still echoes through the halls of the hospital where she worked her scholarship, helping others heal. Mrs. Kim's restaurant still glows at night, her photo smiling in the window as if greeting every passerby. Lan's sons visit their mother's grave each autumn, their voices soft, their heads bowed against the rain. Christie's oak tree stands tall on that quiet hill, its branches heavy with new life each spring. The world keeps moving, the storms keep coming, but love somehow stays. Maybe that's the secret hidden beneath all this tragedy: that the rain never really stops, not because it mourns but because it cleans. It softens the ground where the lost have fallen and makes room for something new to grow. If you've listened this far tonight, maybe you're feeling that same mix of sadness and stillness. Maybe you're thinking about someone you've lost or someone you're afraid to lose. Maybe you're sitting in the dark with the lights off, just listening to the sound of the rain and wondering how something so quiet can carry so much. And if you are, then remember this: stories like these aren't about death. They're about what survives it. They're about the ones who keep loving even when it hurts. The ones who keep remembering even when it's easier to forget. The ones who lock their doors, turn down the lights, and still find the courage to listen. Because in the end, that's what binds all of us: the need to understand, to honor, to feel less alone in the dark. So, wherever you are right now, take a breath, look out the window. The rain is still falling, slow and patient, washing over the streets, the rooftops, the graves, the memories. It's the same rain that's fallen over every story tonight, the same rain that will fall tomorrow, the same rain that reminds us that even after the worst has come, the world keeps whispering forward. And that whisper, soft and endless, carries the only truth worth holding on to. That love never dies, it just learns to speak in quieter ways. So leave a light on tonight. Good night.